Up next, we take you to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania for coverage of a court case heard on Monday, the first day of a 3-year experiment allowing cameras in the courtroom. The experiment covers all manner of civil cases, including bankruptcy, but is restricted to trial court events. The 3-year program does not include criminal proceedings. The case you will now see is E.Beckler versus the Unisys Corporation. The plaintiff, Ms. Becker, maintains that she was laid off at the age of 60 because she did not participate in an early retirement program. Ms. Becker charges Unisys Corporation with age discrimination. We now begin with opening arguments.
All right, has the jury been selected, counsel? Yes. Jury been selected. Before the jury comes in, as I understand it, Mr. Consol's had a chance to examine that exhibit. Is that right?
That's correct, Your Honor.
And you agree essentially that whatever those figures are, apparently they're the ones that Unisys based its conclusion that it had to make a form of layoff, whoever that is, generally.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, well then, Mr. Ellis, I just don't see the need to have a lot of explanation for that up to that point. Now, from that point forward, as to why and how it was developed as to who would fall within that category, that's obviously another matter, and a matter to be heard by the court.
Well, Your Honor, one of the company's contentions in the case is that not only was the layoff that occurred necessary and was deemed because the loss was serious, but that as you continue through the period since February 1989 when the layoff was announced, when Mrs. Becker took retirement, the losses had mounted and had led to continuing layoffs, such that had she not, and this is really quite an important part of the damage case, had she not been laid off, or had she not retired in February 1989, she would have been laid off later in 89 or in 1990 or in 1991 as the successive losses mounted and successive wages of...
Okay, well, okay. So what you're saying is that as this program continued, for whatever these reasons are, primarily financial, right? There came a time when a number of persons would be laid off, or otherwise their relationship would be changed through this early retirement, whatever. Okay, there's no problem with that concept. There were sound business reasons for that number of persons at whatever times it was. Mr. Consol's not quarreling with that. His quarrel is that his client was included in the group. So again, I won't permit the financial witness to testify as the reason for these successive layoffs. I just won't allow it, unless you can show me a different offer of proof. So at the moment, I'll sustain Mr. Consol's objection on the ground he is not disagreeing with the ultimate corporate decision that substantial personnel changes had to be made. His quarrel is his client was included.
Well, Your Honor,
objection sustained. Thank you. Bring in the jury.
Your Honor, this is
Mr. Ellis, I've ruled at least 4 times.
I want to make sure that I understand what my limitations are. For example, can I argue to the jury from that chart?
What do you want to argue from the chart?
I want to show the chart to the jury and explain to the jury that the company was sustaining severe losses, and that's what caused the necessity for reductions.
For the 4th time, you can't do that.
Can I show the chart to the jury?
Why?
So that the jury will understand something more than Mr. Consol's...
Will it help them understand what?
The severity of the economic losses that the company was sustaining.
Okay. For the 5th time, the answer is no. Sit down. Bring in the jury. It's not an issue, Mr. Ellis. It's not an issue.
To get that evidence before the jury.
It's stipulated, and you can tell the jury that counsel stipulated. It's a very customary procedure, and you've done it many times at the trial order. Swear the jury, please.
Members of the jury, please rise. Please raise your right hand. You do swear that you will well and truly
try the issue joined in the civil action number 9-431, wherein Edmonda H. Becker is the plaintiff and Unisys Corporation is the defendant, and that you will a true verdict rendered according to the evidence unless sooner discharged by the court or the cause be withdrawn by the parties, so help you God. Thank you. Please be seated.
Right, member of the jury, you've been selected by the attorneys in this matter to hear this case. We appreciate your willingness to come here to serve as jurors. We realize that serving as a juror takes you away from maybe where you'd rather be, at work or at home or somewhere else. You come to a place and you find yourself in a strange circumstance and maybe seeing people you don't know and maybe hearing a number of terms and phrases and other instructions and the like from the court personnel that are all new to you. So we do realize it can be a first juror experience, or maybe even a second or third one can be sometimes a difficult task, and it's a civic obligation. We appreciate your willingness to come here and serve. You're here to decide this case. You've heard a little bit about the case of Edmonda H. Becker versus Unisys Corporation in the jury selection. You've heard a little bit about it, not much. The manner in which the case will proceed will be that the attorneys for the parties have a chance to make what we call an opening statement to you. Now, the opening statement, member of the jury, is not the attorney's principal argument or final argument in the case. And that is because there's been no evidence received. There's nothing to argue about yet. But the attorneys are permitted to make an opening statement in order to summarize for you briefly what they expect the evidence to be in the case. It's like a preview of what the case will be about. When the opening statements are completed, the plaintiff, in this case Edmonda H. Becker, the lady sitting at this counsel table, will have an opportunity through her lawyer, Mr. Consol, to offer evidence in support of the claim. Jurors decide cases based on the evidence in the case. Evidence is kind of a special word. In order for information to become evidence, it has to satisfy certain standards and certain rules. And the attorneys here are experienced, and they know what those rules are. And they've been preparing this case for some time now, and they are prepared to offer before you and to speak to you through their questions to the witnesses and their opening statements, their understanding of this case. And keep in mind, member of the jury, what the attorneys say in their opening statement or what I say is not evidence in the case. The evidence will come from this witness stand. Persons who testify from the witness stand offer evidence, and you'll decide the case based on the evidence. Evidence also can be in the form of documents or papers, or possibly charts or pictures or photographs. If the court allows you to consider it, then that is evidence, and you're permitted to consider that as jurors in the case. If the court tells you to disregard something that's said or to not consider a particular exhibit or the like, then you cannot consider that. You have to, in a sense, put that aside and not use that as a basis to decide this case. You can only decide the case based on the evidence, and that is the information you're permitted to hear here in this courtroom. Now, when you leave here to go to your homes or even during lunch hour and the like, it's likely you'll see persons in and about the courthouse associated with the case. You'll see the attorneys, you may see some of the parties. They're instructed not to discuss anything with you. So if they don't speak to you, they're not being unkind or discourteous. They're following the court instruction that they not communicate with jurors. I'd also ask you to be very careful when you leave here not to discuss this case with anyone. I'm sure persons at home and other places where you have acquaintances will be interested in your jury service. And they may ask you about the case. And I'd urge you not to discuss the case so long as you're serving on the jury. And the reason for that is many persons that you'll talk to, in an effort to be helpful, may expect you to tell them about their jury experience, or maybe about something they heard about this person or that location. And the difficulty with discussing it, that brings into your knowledge information that is not evidence in this case. So it's better not to discuss the case or any part of it until your jury service is finished on this case. When your jury service is finished, that is, when you've rendered your verdict and you're discharged, Then you can discuss this case with anyone. There's no restriction of any kind about discussing this case or any topic that comes up in this case with anyone. But while you're serving, by taking the oath, you agree that you will just commit your service to this case and the evidence you hear in this courtroom. The way every case begins, members of the jury, as I mentioned a moment before, is for the attorney to make an opening statement. The way the case will close is when the attorneys make a closing argument. And finally, I will give you the instructions. I'll state to you at the end of the case the principles of law that are involved in this case. You might prefer that I tell you that now. Well, I can't tell you what all of them are now because I haven't heard the case either. We're going to listen to the case together. You will consider the evidence because you will be the judges of what we call the facts in the case. You will decide, and only you will decide, what was said and what happened and where did this take place, or did that take place at all, or whatever. That's your role. And neither the attorneys nor the court can take that away from you. The court's role is to decide what the principles of law are that apply. I don't know what the principles of law are that will apply until I've heard all the evidence. I know what some of them are, and I'm telling you some of those now, some of these legal principles. But when the case is finished, the attorneys will assist me by giving me references in the various statutes and cases that they think I should tell you about. And after we've had our conference in that regard, I will give you those instructions. And then you'll go to the jury room, just the 8 of you, and decide the case. And that's how every case works. So this is no different, but it's very important to both sides that you listen to the evidence, do not discuss the case, do not make up your mind and you've heard all the evidence. There's sometimes somebody begins to tell you something that they know or they've heard, and you kind of start to make your mind up about it. I'd ask you in this circumstance as a juror that you not do that. Wait till you've heard all the evidence until you decide anything in the case. And only then, when you're in the jury room together following the court's instructions. In every case, a party has the burden of proof. And in a civil case such as this, the plaintiff has the burden of proof. That is, the plaintiff has the burden of persuading you that she's correct. And the manner in which the plaintiff satisfies that burden of proof is by offering what we call evidence, which is information received by the court in the form of testimony or exhibits, or in some cases, attorneys are permitted to read excerpts from documents and the like to the jury. If the court allows them to do that, I will tell you that's evidence. Sometimes the attorneys will agree to certain things. Attorneys call that a stipulation. That's a fancy word for agreement. If they agree on something or the court allows you to hear it, then it's evidence and you can consider it in the case. The plaintiff offers evidence to witnesses and documents and exhibits and the like, and that's what the plaintiff will do through her counsel in this case. We're going to have a number of exhibits in this case. Exhibits are simply documents and papers, maybe letters or memoranda. This is a case involving this lady's employment with a defendant company, and we're going to have some memoranda and some other things that were generated as she worked there between the various departments, and there might be some other exhibits as well. We'll not give you those exhibits during the trial to read thoroughly. You couldn't take all that time to read it all. And there'll be a number of exhibits here. The attorneys, on occasion, however, may call your attention to a particular excerpt or a particular paragraph, where they may read something from an exhibit. Keep in mind, you'll have the exhibits in the jury room to read for as long as you want and to take as much time to deliberate upon them as you want. So if these exhibits seem to be moving rather promptly through the witnesses and the like, keep in mind, you'll see them all in the jury room. The attorneys will make sure that your attention is brought to those portions of the exhibits that the attorney for either side thinks you should pay attention to with more care than possibly other portions. So with that, let's commence this case by my calling upon the attorney for the plaintiff, Mr. Consol, to make his opening statement to you. Mr. Consol.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. As you know, my name is Stephen Consol, and I have the privilege of representing Mr. Bектl in this case against Unisys Corporation. This is a case about age discrimination and cancer discrimination. You will hear testimony in this case about the fact that Mrs. Bектl, at age 60, less than 1 month after being diagnosed with having cancer, was told by Unisys and a company she had worked for 19 years. And she was either going to be laid off in 3 weeks, or she would have to take retirement. This was being said to her at a time when younger employees actually were going to take over her job duties. Who is Mrs. Becker? Mrs. Becker was born in 1929. At the time of the termination, she was 60 years of age. After raising 7 children at the age of 40, Mrs. Becker went back into the workforce. And she started at the very bottom. She took a clerical position which paid $80 a week at Sperry Corporation. Now, Sperry Corporation is the predecessor to Unisys. It turned into Unisys down the road. Mrs. Becker then began to work her way up through Unisys, through Sperry Corporation. In fact, within 6 years, she obtained the highest award the company gives, the Presidential Award, given to 15 out of approximately 100,000 employees, nominated by your coworkers, not by management. Mrs. Becker received that award. She then went on to get management responsibilities, to become a supervisor, to work her way up the company. She became the first female lobbyist in the history of Sperry. And a lobbyist, she went down and spoke to the senators, to the local congressmen. At the time she was made a lobbyist, there were 75 male lobbyists at Sperry. Mrs. Becker was the first. She was asked on behalf of Sperry to go around the country to give presentations, which she did. In short, she has a glowing and exceptional employment record with Sperry. Sperry merged with Burroughs in 1986 to form Unisys. Now these names, you may get confused on, I have, but Unisys is the formation of 2 very large computer companies, Sperry and Burroughs. And when Unisys was formed, the headquarters was in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania, the same place that Mrs. Becker had worked for Sperry. And her job duties of handling community relations, of handling employee events, of doing certain publicity for the company, changed slightly, but not significantly. And she continued to work at the Blue Bell location for Unisys Corporation. She was in a department which was known as Public Affairs. Public Affairs was in turn part of a larger department known as Communications. And Communications was headquartered at Blue Bell, where Mrs. Becker was. Public Affairs, however, had a location in Detroit, which is where Burroughs used to be. Therefore, Mrs. Becker's presence at Public Affairs in Blue Bell was very significant because she was the local public affairs person at the corporate headquarters of this company. Now, in 1988, Unisys decided that it was going to reduce its payroll and reduce its workforce. And we are not here arguing in any way, shape, or form the right of that company to do that. They have that right. What this case is about is not do they have the right, but who do they choose? And do they discriminate in the choice? Now, as I said, Mrs. Becker was part of Public Affairs. In Public Affairs, the staff vice president was a gentleman known as David Curry. You will hear this name repeatedly throughout the trial. Mr. Curry is advised that he is to look at his employees and decide who are the most expendable. In other words, if someone is going to be let go in his department, who is going to be the first to go, or the second to go, or the third to go? And Mr. Curry chooses as the #1 person to go, the oldest employee, the highest salary employee, Mrs. Becker. And he makes that decision at a time when there is one other public affairs person located in Blue Bell. Her name is Marlene Wojek, 33 years of age, just transferred less than 6 months before from Detroit to Blue Bell, married to a lawyer at Blue Bell, with less than 1 year experience in this position. So Mr. Curry makes the choice right at the outset that the 60-year-old, 19-year veteran, Mrs. Becker, goes and the part-time 33-year-old person stays. Now, Unisys also made a decision at the time they decided that they were going to reduce their workforce, that they should target the older workers to entice them to leave the company. And they formulated what was known as a voluntary retirement incentive program, and it's referred to as VRIP, V-R-I-P. And it was a program that said, basically, that if you were 58 years of age and had been with the company, including Sperry and Burroughs, the predecessor companies, had been with the company at least 15 years, you would have extra money added to your pension to encourage you to retire. So they were targeting older people with just an incentive program. At the same time, however, they decided that they were also going to change the post-retirement medical benefits that the older workers at Unisys had from their prior companies. And this wasn't an enhancement to those workers. This was a costly change. In other words, if the older workers stayed at Unisys, did not take retirement, as of April 1st, 1989, which coincided exactly with the date when they would be out if they chose retirement, they would have to pay more money for their medical benefits when they eventually retired from the company. At the same time this is occurring, everyone at higher management levels is making potential layoff lists like the kind I've spoken to you about. And you will see these layoff lists, they're always changing. People are coming off lists, going on lists. But Mrs. Becker, she stays on that list, right at the top. Now, on January 4th, 1989, Mrs. Becker visits her doctor, Dr. McKenna. And Dr. McKenna will testify in this case on behalf of Mrs. Becker. Dr. McKenna is her family doctor, and he diagnoses a lump in her breast. A mammography is performed the next day, and the results are not good. There is a strong suspicion of cancer. That cancer is then conclusively diagnosed in January. As soon as Mrs. Becker finds out each step of the way what her medical condition is, she immediately lets the company know. What does the company do? Well, there's another gentleman who will testify in this case, named Rudolph Neary. Mr. Neary is Vice President of Human Resources at Unisys. And Mr. Neary has the responsibility, among others, to go through lists and see whether or not, in his mind, just from looking at the list, there's discrimination. Mr. Neary himself sees Mrs. Becker, age 60, 19 years, on a layoff list where Ms. Wojak, part-time employee, age 33, just moved into public affairs at Bluebell, is remaining. And he admits that the thought of discrimination went into his mind. What does he then do? Does he go and investigate the situation to find out why is Mrs. Becker being laid off? No. He decides instead to issue directives whereby the company will also get rid of Ms. Wojak, thereby covering up the decision process. So no one will know that one time Wojak was going to stay and Mrs. Becker wasn't. But we have the memo, and you will see the memo of January 11, 1989, confirming this plan. And Mrs. Becker remains on the layoff list. Of course, people don't tell her that. In fact, on January 16, 1989, Mrs. Becker has a performance review by Ms. Wilgin, who was her immediate supervisor, who reported to that Mr. Curry, who put her on the list. Ms. Wilgin and Mrs. Becker discuss all the work that is necessary for Mrs. Becker to be doing for the coming year. Now, this is January 16, 1989. Mrs. Wilgin, at that point, knows of the cancer situation. On January 31st, 1989, Unisys announces to its employees the VRIP program, the retirement program, as well as the change in post-retirement benefits. And at this time, a Mr. Upman, another name, another human resources person, a person who reports directly to Rudolph Hearing, Mr. Upman makes a rare visit to Mrs. Becker, and he talks to her about cancer and her cancer. And he knows, because he had cancer. He knows what she's going through. He knows the torment that she is going through. What he doesn't tell Mrs. Becker is that on December 20th of 1988, a little more than a month before, he had compiled his own little retirement list, his own handwriting, where he went through and he just made notes of everybody that he assumed was just going to retire. And Mrs. Becker's name is on that list, even though he never spoke to her. And Mrs. Becker, he says, is 90% certain to go, which was not true. So Mr. Upman, after making the list, comes and visits Mrs. Becker. And they talk. And they discuss some of the programs. And Mr. Upman admits he doesn't have certain knowledge about the details of these programs and the changes in medical benefits. So he sets up another meeting. And the meeting he sets up is for February 2nd. Now, February 2nd is the day before Mrs. Becker was going in for her preoperative test. On February 7th, 5 days later, she was going to Montgomery Hospital, she was going to Jefferson Hospital, and have surgery performed on her breast for the cancer. 5 days later. Mr. Upman calls in Mrs. Becker, and he says, the real reason why I brought you in today is that I have to tell you that if you don't retire, in 3 weeks, you're getting laid off. And Mrs. Becker is shocked. She is worried about the decisions she has to make with the cancer, with the treatment. Do I do radiation? Do I do chemotherapy? What kind of surgeries performed? And now this has landed on her, and Mr. Upman repeatedly stresses she has only those two choices. Either she retires or she gets laid off in 3 weeks. And she literally stumbles out of the room. And you will hear the testimony of Cheryl McCauley, who still works at Unisys, and who saw Mrs. Becker come out of the room, and describes her as physically shaky, as pale. Mrs. Becker now is put in a position where 5 days before her surgery, she's told she's losing her job. On February 6th, she stays at work right up to the day she goes to surgery. So on February 6th, Ms. Wilden flies in from Detroit. Now this is the immediate supervisor. And Mrs. Becker says, is this true? I don't have a choice. Ms. Wilden just shrugs her shoulders. That was her choice. Mrs. Becker then, on February 7th, goes into the hospital and has surgery performed for breast cancer. And she plans on returning. In fact, she thought she'd be out 3 or 4 weeks, and she wanted to come back to work. On that meeting with Ms. Wilden on the 6th, she told Ms. Wilden that. She said, I want to come back. I'm going to be back. What happens when I come back?
Well, let me make this suggestion. Rather than repeat every detail of every witness's testimony, it'd be better to briefly summarize it. It's supposed to be an outline. You can argue all this later when the jury's heard it. There may come a time when they don't know if they heard from you or from the witness stand, so let's not go into so much detail here. Just summarize your claims, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Mrs. Becker returns to Unisys after her surgery. No one approaches her. She, in the meantime, sends a letter dying up and saying she feels she's being forced out. She fills out her retirement form, strikes out the word voluntary. No one comes up to her and says, why do you feel it's voluntary or involuntary? She remains at work until her last day. David Curry never so much speaks a word to her, and then she leaves the company. And when she leaves the company, she's going through radiation treatment for her cancer, which continues through May. Now, I just mentioned a few other names, and I'll be brief with these. You remember the name Marley Wogan? I told you she was the individual, the part-timer who first was scheduled to stay. Did she lose her job? No. She's taken out of public affairs in Bluebell and given a full-time position at the same time this happens, making more money. Cheryl McCauley, the individual who saw Mrs. Becker come out of the meeting with Mr. Ullman. Does she lose her job? She's 33 years old. No. In fact, she remains in communications, even though by her own admission she has hours, days, and even weeks of literally nothing to do. At the same time, Mrs. Bектl was very busy. There was another retirement in public affairs. Ms. Zilke opening up another slot. Is Ms. Becker offered this job? No. Who's offered this job? A 33-year-old who never worked in public affairs in her life. And even a year later, another public affairs representative is hired. Is Mrs. Becker offered that job? No. Again, a 30-year-old with no experience as a public affairs representative is offered that job. Mrs. Becker has sustained economic loss and emotional loss. You will hear her testimony concerning the economic loss. She has not had a paying job since she left. She volunteers for a hospital and does parish work for her church, but she does not get paid. And you will hear loss and testimony for loss from an emotional standpoint. The way she felt when she was put in this situation of having a double hit of cancer and losing her job. At the conclusion of the case, I will stand before you again, and I will review what I discussed in this opening. I will review the testimony that was presented in this case. And I will ask you to look at that evidence, and at that time, to reach a verdict for Mrs. Becker and against the company that forced her out at age 60 with cancer. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ellis.
Your Honor, I'd like, if I could, to set up one of the charts, exhibit charts for the...
All right, sure. One of those that is permissible. Mr. Ellis, I think there's a pointer right here over the ledge. See there? If you need that.
Thank you very much.
If you need it. All right. Can all you see that, member of the jury? All right, Mr. Ellis will point out certain portions of that and maybe read certain notations on there.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Over the next few days, while your jurors sitting in this courtroom, you're going to learn a great deal about something that's become as common in America in the 1990s as what televisions in the courtroom may become. And that is the economic effect of a business downturn, a recession, a depression. You may know it as hard times. Mr. Consol has agreed to stipulate, and the court has accepted the stipulation, that during the period from the end of 1988 through the present, Unisys Corporation, one of the largest corporations in the United States, has lost about $1.2 billion. And that's what drives everything that you're going to hear about in the courtroom today, and tomorrow, and probably for the next few days. Now, as Mr. Consol said, Unisys is a very large corporation. And you're going to learn through the testimony that Unisys was formed in about 1986 through the merger of two existing very large computer companies, Sperry Corporation and Burroughs Corporation. Now, when the companies merged, they became Unisys. Now, you may know Sperry, by the way, for those of you who lived in the Philadelphia area for a while. You may know Sperry as Univac, because when Sperry originally started up, it was called Univac back in the 1940s and 50s. Now, what you're going to learn about here in this courtroom is what happens to the employees, and to a particular group of employees that are represented on the chart I have here in front of you, when the economy goes bad, and when a company has to lay off employees. Unisys Corporation, you will learn, has lost, well, they started out with about 122,000 employees. That was in 1986. They're presently down to about 70,000 employees, with some prospect that it would go lower. And what we're going to talk about in this courtroom is not pretty. What happened to Mrs. Becker is not pretty. And nobody here should think it is. It's going to be a very, very sad story, something that Mrs. Beckler did absolutely nothing to deserve. However, it's a story that Unisys is going to put on. It's a discussion of what happens to these companies in this situation. Now, what I'm giving here is called an opening statement. I'd like to introduce to you the other people you'll see at council table, because you'll see them, and I know sometimes jurors wonder what they're doing here. Seated just to my left at council table is Rudolph Neering. Mr. Neering, as introduced by Mr. Consol, is the Vice President for Human Resources at Unisys. He's going to testify probably very early in the trial. Seated next to him is Beth Begas. Beth is what we call paralegal. She's responsible for making sure these exhibits are here, the exhibits are in order, the witnesses get to the courtroom at the right time. She does other valuable duties. Seated behind them in the first row, the fellow in the yellow tie is Mark Stevenson. He's an attorney who works directly for Unisys. And seated next to him is Chuck Casper. Chuck works with my law firm. He's a colleague of mine. And they both work very, very hard to put this case together to present to you. Now, as I said, this is an opening statement. I'm supposed to give you an outline. What I'm going to do is give you an outline of what the testimony is going to show. I'm not going to give you every detail, because that can only come from the witnesses themselves. The company is going to present essentially 4 witnesses that will tell the guts of its case. When I say the guts, I mean the actual decision makers in the decision-making process that led to Mrs. Beckler's retirement. Mr. Neering is one of them. You'll hear from him probably very early in the case. The second person is a man named David Curry. And what I've done here is I've had prepared an organization chart of Mr. Curry's group of people, the people that Mr. Curry has working for him, or had working for him, as of the fall of 1988, in a unit called Corporate Communications. Mr. Curry is the person who initially proposed a reorganization of this group that would have left Mrs. Beckler out. And what Mr. Consol says about that is quite true. The next witness you'll hear from, and not in any particular order, is a man named Donnie Upman. Now, Donnie Upman is in the field of human resources, and he's a fellow who works for Mr. Neering. What Mr. Neering does not know about the testimony, or excuse me, what he does not know about the decision-making process, Mr. Upman probably does know, because Mr. Upman is the guy who actually prepared the layoff list and that sort of thing. The final witness of our 4 main witnesses is Jeanette Lerman. Now, Jeanette Lerman was Mr. Curry's boss. He's up here somewhere on the organization chart. Jeanette Lerman is not available to testify. She no longer works for Unisys Corporation, but we took her deposition on videotape about 2 weeks ago. So at some point this week, or maybe early next week, we will have television in and let you watch the deposition of Jeanette Lerman on videotape. She was the boss, like I say, way up here, and she pretty much is responsible for approving the decision that Mr. Curry proposed. Now, these 4 employees that you're going to hear from are the people who actually made all the decisions here. They're responsible for Mrs. Beckler's decision to take retirement to the extent she isn't responsible for it herself. Now, I want to give you a brief summary of what the testimony is going to be. First of all, let me refer here to the organization chart. I'll use the pointer to do that. As we said, the Unisys Corporation arose out of a merger between Sperry and Burroughs. Sperry was headquartered in Bluebell, Pennsylvania, out in Montgomery County, it's a suburb of Philadelphia. Burroughs was headquartered in Detroit, Michigan. They merged. You had a great deal of duplication. I think that's the word, duplication of effort. So what they had, as of the fall of 1988, is 2 libraries, 2 corporate libraries. One of them was located in Bluebell, one was located in Detroit. They also had this unit called Public Affairs. Now, Public Affairs is essentially responsible for, well, it's in large part responsible for, and you'll hear testimony about this, they give away the company's money. They're responsible for making charitable contributions to organizations that come to a big company and say, hey, would you fund this? Or would you help us with this particular project? And that's what these people do. Well, there were 2 public affairs organizations, one in Bluebell and one in Detroit. There's also a unit here called Sports Marketing, which comes from Burroughs. Sports Marketing does things like provide the computer services for the U.S. Golf League and provide computer services for the U.S. Tennis League. And the upshot of it all is that Unisys gets a benefit by having their computers seen on the pictures of the tournament. That's what that means. But again, we're talking about giving away the company's computers, giving away the money. Now, you will notice Unisys is a computer company. None of these people make computers. They're basically responsible for giving away money and running the libraries. Now, the result of that is that in the fall of 1988, when the company realized that it was going to have these staggering losses, and they were foreseen, the company took steps to try to save itself. In other words, they're trying to save the employees that are left. And in order to do that, they've got to reduce some of the people who are there. They told Mr. Curry he had to cut his force. He had to cut the number of employees that worked for him. And over the past 2 years or so, since Mr. Curry began that process, he's cut practically everybody off of this set of sort of trees that we have here. There are 27 names in the case. You will hear testimony that of those 27 names, there are only 8 of them that are currently employed at Unisys today in any capacity. One of them, of course, is Mr. Curry himself. A couple things that the company is going to present that are a little different from what Mr. Consul told me. Mrs. Becker is not the oldest person in that organization. To the contrary, this woman down here, you see, library clerk, temporary, A. Chris. She's the oldest employee in that unit, and you'll find that out. Mrs. Becker is not the best paid employee in the unit. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm not feeling well there. The best paid person in the unit is Carol Wilton. That's Becker's boss. So you have to take that into consideration when you measure what the plaintiff's case is going to be, because I don't get to go until second. Now, the first, of the people that the company is going to have testify, Mr. Neary is going to testify as to exactly what human resources does. You folks may or may not have familiarity with the human resources department of the company. Mr. Rudy Neary is going to try to give you some familiarity with what they do. Essentially, they deal with employment matters, wages, hiring, and regrettably, layoffs, decisions to make layoffs. You're going to also hear from Mr. Curry, and Mr. Curry is going to testify essentially that when it came time for him to reduce force in the fall of 1988, he made basically 2 decisions. Number 1, he eliminated the Detroit Library. Number 2, he eliminated public affairs at Blue Belt. That's basically the decision he made. There are some minor exceptions, there are some fringe elements of that, but essentially he knocked out the library in Detroit and the Blue Belt Public Affairs Organization. Now, that's not something Mr. Curry is happy to testify to. It's not something that anybody else in the company is happy about. But it had to be done in the judgment of the people that run that part of the company in order to save the people who are left. Now, you're also going to hear from Mr. Upman. Mr. Upman is, as I said before, an HR human resource employee who works for Mr. Neary. Something very, very important you have to know about Mr. Upman. He got cancer. He's got it now. He's had it for about 2.5 years. He is an individual who had cancer and had surgery for cancer about a month before Mrs. Becker did. Now, there came a point during the layoff process when it became known at Unisys. Now, before I explain this, I've got to tell you what the layoff process is. You're going to hear evidence to the fact that the layoff process in this unit began in September 1988. Okay, that's about 5 months before Mrs. Becker took retirement. So, throughout the fall of 1988, there's a discussion going on between the various people at the company over what the best course of action would be for this unit here, for Mr. Curry's unit. And you're going to hear all the discussion that the Unisys people remember. This is a long time ago. They laid off a lot of people, but to the extent they remember, I'm going to put on every word of what they remember so that you're able to make a decision as to whether they were violating some law when they made these decisions. But you're going to hear that testimony. You're going to hear that throughout the fall, long before Mrs. Becker knew that she had cancer, the company had essentially decided to eliminate that function of Blue Belt. Now, Mr. Upman and Mr. Neary felt a great deal of empathy for Mrs. Beckler. Mr. Upman, for obvious reasons, he was suffering from the same thing she was suffering from. You'll also hear that Mr. Neary had had an experience with cancer in his life that made him very, very empathetic towards Mrs. Beckler. And they decided, out of concern for her, they decided that they, if they were in her position, would like to be told that a potential layoff was coming, that their job was being eliminated. So they went and told her. Now, like I said before, it wasn't pretty, but that's what happened. And that's why it's happened, and that's what the employees of Unisys Corporation are going to tell them. Now, you're also going to hear, as I said, from Mr. Curry and Jeanette Lerman about the functions of this group. You're going to get a lot of details about how a corporation runs. As you probably gathered by now, this is just a tiny little unit. This is 27 people out of a 70,000, at this point it's about 80,000 person corporation. There are units above this and around it. You're going to learn a little bit about the structure of the corporation in order to make your decisions. We're going to try to give you absolutely as much as we can, because we think that if you understand the full story, you're going to end up finding that you're a defendant. Now, I have one final thing to tell you. After we're done, I said there were going to be 4 main witnesses. It's going to be Jeanette Lerman, Rudy Neary, Donnie Hubman, and David Curry. Those are the 4 main witnesses who are involved in the decision-making process. There may be other company witnesses who testify, depending on what Mrs. Becker's witnesses say. We also are going to present 2 expert witnesses. We're going to present Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Brian Sullivan, who's an economist. And he's going to explain to you that Mrs. Becker's losses aren't as serious as she may have you believe. One of the main reasons for that is this thing that Mr. Consul referred to, and he called it the VRIP. That stands for Voluntary Retirement Incentive Program. A VRIP is really very simple. When the company is interested in laying people off, and is interested in reducing force, one way to do it, and to keep everybody happy, is to put what they call a sweetener in the pension program. It, in effect, adds years of service and adds credit to an employee who takes the retirement within a particular period. Mrs. Becker elected to retire within the period covered by this VRIP plan. And as a result, she's receiving a substantially larger pension than she would have received had she not. She's also got another benefit that occurred at the same time, and that is what I think Mr. Consul referred to as the retiree medical benefit program. See, when an employee retires from Unisys has medical coverage for that person for the rest of their life. And most big companies are like that, maybe you know that. When an employee retires from Unisys, he gets a particular package, and he has to pay a certain amount every month for that package. Well, remember I said there was a merger. Okay, the merger is something that you really can't lose sight of here. Before the merger, there was a Sperry plan, and there was a Burris plan. Then the companies merged, but for the first couple of years, they kept the 2 plans, and depending on which company the employee had worked for, he would get either the Sperry plan or the Burris plan. They were both very, very good plans. Now, remember what I said in the beginning here, that you're talking about economic bad times. As of the spring of 1989, Unisys was forced to cut the benefits in the Sperry and Burris plans. And the way they did it was to set up a new plan. It's called the Unisys plan. Now, by retiring before the cutoff date of the old plans, Mrs. Becker was able to lock into the benefits in the old Sperry plan. She was an old Sperry employee. I should say she was an employee of the former Sperry company. And by locking into those benefits, she saved a lot of money for a long time in the future. So that's what Mr. Sullivan is going to testify to. We're also going to present testimony from Dr. Sadoff. Dr. Sadoff is a distinguished psychiatrist who examined Mrs. Becker at our request when we found out that she said that she had mental problems resulting from the decision to take retirement. Now, Dr. Sadoff examined her and he will testify that, yes, Mrs. Becker went through some stress. Cancer is a very stressful thing. Having your job eliminated and stopping working after all those years is a very stressful thing. But essentially, Mrs. Becker's handling it very well, and she could be working today if she wants to. Now, she's not working today. She hasn't tried to get work. She's essentially acted as a retiree of Unisys Corporation. And she has not tried to seek work. She turned down an offer that Unisys gave her at the point she retired to come back as a part-time employee on a consultant-type basis. We'll hear testimony about that, too. We contend, and we're going to ask you to find it, she hasn't done what the law calls mitigation of damages. And the judge will instruct you that at some point during his closing instructions to the jury. Now, just as Mr. Consol is going to come back to you in a little while and ask you to find for Mrs. Becker, the plaintiff, I'm going to be coming back to you shortly after he does, as a matter of fact, and I'm going to ask you to find for Unisys and the defendant in this case. And between now and then, between now and the time I get up in front of you like this another time, I'm going to ask you to do two things for me. Number one, listen to the testimony very carefully. And number two, remember, there's two sides to the story. We wouldn't be here. And that when the plaintiff's evidence comes in, there's always another side to be heard. I'm going to make sure that the evidence is integrated so that you'll hear it. And then I think you'll be convinced and you'll find in favor of the defendant. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, member of the jury, I think we'll recess at the time. It's about 20 of 1. We'll recess until 20 of 2. So just return at 20 of 2 directly to the jury room right behind where you're sitting. And meanwhile, recall what I've said about your role as jurors. You've now heard the attorneys summarize to you what they think the evidence will be. What the evidence is, you'll determine from the witnesses and the other evidence that's offered. Keep in mind what the attorneys say is not evidence. It's what the witnesses and what the other evidence says the facts are that will make up the evidence in this case. So with that, member of the jury, you may step out and return at 20 of to the jury room. Thank you very much. You may step out. We can make that quarter of. Make it quarter of, member of the jury. Quarter of, thank you. Return a quarter of. That's easier to remember, I think. All right. All right, counsel, you can leave all your papers there. Not necessary to move anything, and we'll return then a quarter of. Thank you. Oh, let me ask you, is there a sequestration order in place here or not?
Yes, Your Honor, I think we agreed to exactly what Mr. Ellis spoke to you about.
All right, well, as you know, what I do, I have to let the attorneys more or less self-discipline this sequestration, because persons who come in and out, I don't know if they'll be witnesses or not. So occasionally just look back, and if you happen to see someone who may have inadvertently come in the courtroom who shouldn't be here, you can just let the clerk know, and we'll have the clerk come back and ask the person to step outside. I don't think that'll happen, but I'll leave it up to the attorneys. Now, I usually consider the sequestration order to be kind of a best efforts. If something goes wrong, I can't imagine it being the basis of a new trial or mistrial, but use your best efforts to sequester witnesses. Right. Thank you very much. All right, recess to quarter. Thank you.
Please rise. The court is now in session.
All right, have the jury committee, please. Now you're seated. Thank you. Yeah, while the jury's coming in, I've examined these two letters. I believe that the material is privileged, and I'll make a more formal ruling later, but I think the material that is not shown in these exhibits is privileged, attorney-client privilege, and I'll sustain either Mr. Ellis's objection to having them disclosed, or I'll deny the objection, asking they be disclosed. So we'll rule upon that later. Have the jury come in, please. I'll put those in an envelope, have them sealed, in case there's any question at a later time. May be seated, member of the jury. Thank you. All right, member of the jury, as I mentioned before, we recessed. Will now commence the offering of evidence in this case. And because every plaintiff has the burden of proof, the plaintiff goes first. And I'll call upon Mr. Consol to make his first offer of evidence to the jury. Please, Mr. Consol.
Thank you, Your Honor. I was called Mrs. Becker to the stand.
All right, Mr. Becker, please come up to the witness stand. All right, please tell us your full name and spell your last name, please.
I'm Edmunda Becker, B-E-C-K-E-R. I'm known as Bunny.
All right. And please place your hand on this Bible right here. The testimony you're about to give, do you swear to tell the truth so help you God?
Yes, I do.
All right, let me take a hand to the Bible. Make yourself comfortable. I'm going to ask you to try to keep your voice up. And you can also move that chair a little closer so you're comfortable.
All right.
All right, Mr. Consol.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Becker, what is your date of birth?
I was born January 7th, 1929.
So you are presently 62 years of age.
That's right.
Where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia.
And how many children were in your family?
Okay, I was the youngest of 7 children.
Whereabouts in Philadelphia did you grow up?
I was born in North Philadelphia, 1809 North Grath Street, and lived there for 11 years.
And then where did you move?
And then we moved to Germantown, 216 East Johnson Street in Germantown. And then I was married, and I moved from there to West Oak Lane. We bought a house in West Oak Lane, 69th and Ogons.
Did you graduate from high school, Mrs. Becker?
Yes, I did. I graduated from Little Flower High School in Philadelphia.
And after you graduated from high school, did you go to work?
Yes, I did. I worked at the First Pennsylvania Company for 9 years.
And in what particular type of job?
Well, I started out in the bookkeeping department, and then I worked in the credit department for a couple of years, and then I worked in the tax department for 3 years.
And before, you said you worked for First Pennsylvania. Did that acquire Germantown Trust Bank?
Yes, I started out at Germantown Trust, and they were acquired by First Pennsylvania Company.
Okay. You indicated you married Russell.
I met my husband at First Pennsylvania Bank, and we were married in 1950.
I believe you stated you continued to work at First Pennsylvania until 1955.
Right. At the time, my oldest living son was born in 1955.
And how many children do you have, Mrs. Becker?
I had 7 live births, but my first child was born dead.
Now, after your first child was born, did you then stop working?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I stopped for a period of 15 years. After my other children were born, there were 7 of them.
And your 7 children were born over a 10-year period?
Yes, they were.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention to your entry back into the employment market. And what year was that you went back for work?
It was in 1970 that I went back to work.
And with whom did you first start to work?
There was a little company over in Fort Washington called FSI, and I had put an application in UNIVAC, but I hadn't heard from them, so I took this job over at FSI in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania.
And so that we're clear, UNIVAC is the same as Sperry?
Yes, it is, predecessor.
And then did you commence working for FSI?
I worked for them from August until November, at which time UNIVAC sent me a telegram and said to come on in for an interview, which I did.
And did you eventually obtain a job with Sperry UNIVAC?
Yes, I did.
What job was that?
The job that I started at was in the disbursement department. It was actually a subset, the payroll department, and what we did was we computed the commissions that were earned by salespeople on the different types of equipment that they sold.
What was your first salary?
$80 a week.
And this was a full-time job?
Oh, yes, it was. Yes.
And for how long did you hold this job?
I was there a little less than a year, at which time I was recruited by the woman who was supervisor in the employee benefits department.
And you were recruited for what position?
There was a clerical position there that she had open that handled disability claims for the employees on the Bluebell payroll.
What department was that in?
That was in Human Resources.
And you say that you handled certain types of employee benefits claims?
Yes, it started out with short-term disability and long-term disability. And then after a while, I started doing insurance claims for the employees too. Now, there were 14,000 employees on the Bluebell payroll at that time, so we were handling claims for 14,000 employees.
And briefly, when you say handling claims, what were you doing?
All right, the claims were mailed into us, and we certified them that that person was an employee of the company and that they were entitled to be paid by the insurance company. We made a record of the claim, and then we sent it to the insurance company to be paid. And after the payments were made, we also then marked that on the card that the claim was satisfied.
And if there were any disputes, would you help the employees?
We did indeed, and there were a lot of disputes. And what we did was we sat down with the employees who were in the Bluebell area and listened to their story, talked to the insurance company, tried to work out and iron out any problems that were there. And the people who were not right in Bluebell, we took telephone calls from them and did the same thing for them.
Did you then, in or about April of 1972, receive a promotion?
Yes, I did.
To what position?
Insurance claim specialist, I believe. I'm not quite clear on the title.
Was that still in Human Resources?
Yes, yes it is.
What were your job duties in that position?
Well, at that point, I was more or less a lead person with the other clerical people in the department. I was training them to do some of the work that I had done before. And I was also doing some of the work, the new people who came into the department.
Did you then, in or about December of 1972, receive another promotion?
Yes, I did.
And to what position was that?
I can't remember the title of that position, but there were progressive promotions.
This was all in Human Resources?
All in Human Resources.
And in these promotions that you received, did you then begin to manage people?
Yes, I did. I became assistant supervisor in this department, helping the supervisor by training the new employees and working out new systems to handle the claims also.
Now, did there come a time when you started to do retirement or pre-retirement seminars?
Yes, yes there was. I started out in Bluebell to do pre-retirement sessions for our employees who were age 55 and above. And what this was a 3-day seminar that we would call in resource people to help our older employees to start to plan for retirement at an age where it wouldn't be on them suddenly. They would have 10 or 15 years to do their planning and understand more about the process of retirement.
And in this job, would you meet with the people then and directly speak to them?
We had our employees and their spouses into these seminars.
Was there an award at Sperry referred to as the Presidential Award?
Yes, there was.
And would you please explain to the members of the jury what the Presidential Award was?
Well, it's a very prestigious award to begin with. It's something, the winners are nominated by the people they work with to begin with, not management people, but the management people had to okay applications. So applications come into a central board from your coworkers. And this process went on all across the globe, really, wherever Unisys was.
And how many employees were there that were eligible for this award?
Well, there were over 100.
What period of time are we talking about now?
1976.
Right now, this is, she said Unisys, is this before Unisys?
I'm sorry.
This is
that was
Sperry.
Well, just so we're to keep it through, because there is a time change and a company change here.
Correct, Your Honor. Thank
Yes.
you.
So this is 1976, and this has to do with Sperry, is that right?
Well, it was UNIVAC, I believe, still, but under the umbrella, the Sperry umbrella. All right. There were over 100,000 people on the payroll all over the world.
And how many people were given this presidential award?
There were 15.
Did you receive this award?
Yes, I did, and I was shocked to receive it, and I was pleased to receive it, and it's something that I cherish.
Now, after you received the presidential award, did you have a position of pre-retirement administrator?
That's correct. My title was changed to pre-retirement administrator because at a period in time, I assumed the duties of the seminars for our employees around the United States, not just in Bluebell, and I started to take that program out to wherever the Bluebell employees were.
When you say the Bluebell employees, what do you mean?
All right, I mean the Bluebell, the employees who were paid on the Bluebell payroll. They could be in California, they could be in Texas, they could be in Chicago, they could be in Florida, they could be anywhere, but they actually tiered in for payment and for all other administrative things to Bluebell.
And in this position, you were still in human resources?
Yes, I was.
Now, in or about 1982, did you become a manager of employee benefits and community relations?
Yes, I did. That was the title I was told to use because I was doing several things. I was doing some community relations work, I was doing the pre-retirement work, and I was also still doing the benefits work. I had become the lead person in the benefits department.
And was this, again, a promotion for you?
Yes, it was.
You mentioned community relations and that you were doing community relations work. Would you explain that, please?
There's a number of ways you can do community relations work. Some of what I was doing in 1982, I was appointed to be a congressional action representative.
Is that a lobbyist?
That is a lobbyist. I received my appointment from the president of Sperry Corporation in New York, and the reaffirmation from the president of UNIVAC in Bluebell. And what it meant was that we kept in touch closely with our state senators and legislators. And once a year, we went to Washington and were briefed on position papers of legislation that was pending that had a bearing on the computer industry. And then what we did was we actually met with Senator Hines, Senator Specter, Representative Schultz, Representative Coughlin, to go over the position that our company was taking on the pending legislation.
And when you would meet with these senators and congressmen, how big a group would this be?
There would be 3 of us from Bluebell, and they would be meeting with the local people. There would be another group from Minnesota meeting with the Minnesota people. There would be.
Now, at the time when you were selected to be a congressional action representative, were there any other female representatives or lobbyists in the company?
No, there wasn't. I was the first who was selected. And
how many lobbyists were there at that time? How many male lobbyists?
The number was between 75 and 80.
And you did not apply for that position?
No, I didn't.
You were selected?
Yes, correct.
Were you also asked by the company to give seminars?
Yes. We had benefit seminars
When
would these seminars be given?
Okay. On a yearly basis, there were benefit seminars given at different locations throughout the United States. And the reason for this was that the group that would be in Florida, it would be close to them one year. The group that would be in Chicago, it would be close to them another year. And what happened was that certain of us were given assignments to research something that had to do with benefits, something new perhaps, and present it to the group, so it was a learning process.
Did you do this from approximately 1978 to 86?
Yes, I did.
Was this considered an honor to be asked to do this?
Yes, it was.
And why is that?
Because it took a person who understood benefits to begin with to delve into something new that was coming up. One of the things that I remember doing a research project on was HMOs before they were actually offered to employees. And I had to do research on that and present it to our other benefits people from the United States so they would understand it when it came along.
Now, Mrs. Becker, I'd like to direct your attention, I think we're up to 1985 or thereabouts. And this is the year before the merger that created Unisys. As of that time, did you hold the position of manager of community relations?
Yes, I did. I was appointed manager of community relations, and at that time, my job was transferred from human resources to the communications department.
What were your job duties in this position?
Well, this entailed a lot of things. It had to do with contributions in the Philadelphia area and Blue Bell area to organizations that we supported, nonprofit organizations that we supported. It included outreach to the schools in the community. It included having to deal with the local government, the Whitpain government. That's where the Unisys location now is, in Blue Bell, and the county government, that type of thing.
You mentioned contributions, and would you please explain what these contributions were?
All right. They were modest. The contributions that we made from Blue Bell were modest. The large foundation monies were in New York at that time, in 1985. So we had a modest budget in Blue Bell, and we stretched it as far as we could to give some amounts of money to the United Ways and to the Easter Seal, places like that. The nonprofit organizations in the community that would be helping our employees.
Did you have any responsibilities that included board memberships?
Yes, I did. It was my responsibility to replace board members who had retired from, let's say, hospital boards. And I had to find the appropriate person to take their place.
Did you have any budget responsibilities in this position?
Yes, I did. I had a modest budget. And my budget tiered in through the communications department. I would tell them what my needs would be for the year, and it tiered into.
Now, were there also some special events that you were involved in?
Yes, there were.
And could you give us an example of such a special event?
Well, we did special events for our employees down at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. We reserved the place for a Sunday and had our employees come in to see the works of art. That's the type of thing.
Did you do any work for any state hospitals?
Oh, yes. There were two other things that we did and we had done for a number of years. One of them was at Christmas time we gave a dinner party for the patients from three of the local state hospitals. And we recruited volunteers within the company one-on-one so that there would be a volunteer for every patient who came. And that volunteer had the responsibility of buying a gift for the patient from the state hospital and sitting and eating with them and dancing with them and generally making sure they had a very good time of an evening. Now, this was held at Unisys headquarters in Blue Bell.
And again, you're using the word Unisys, but this is...
All right, at that time it was Sperry because it went on for 10 years, but it still continued into the Unisys time. The other thing was that we took a number of students from the Eastern State School to Dorney Park. Again, this was a one-on-one thing where employees would volunteer to be with one of the young people for the day. We always had more volunteers than we could handle because everybody loved helping out.
Now, before the merger that formed Unisys, was there a time when Sperry wanted to move its corporate headquarters?
Yes, in 1986, the corporate headquarters from New York was being transferred down to Bluebell. And it wasn't done all at one fell swoop. It was done in pieces. Different departments came down at different times.
Now, I've made reference to the merger that formed Unisys, and that was in 1986.
Yes.
Is that right? So that was shortly after Sperry moved its corporate headquarters to Bluebell?
That's correct.
Would you explain what the merger was as you understood it?
Well, the merger was not a friendly merger to begin with, but once it was accomplished and the dust started to settle down, everybody pretty much did their job.
So after the merger, the people that had worked for Sperry and the people that had worked for Burroughs now worked for Unisys?
That's correct.
And after the merger, what department were you in?
I was in communications department to begin with. I was still in communications, but the subset of my job was public affairs.
Where was the communications department headquartered?
It was in Bluebell.
And who was the vice president of communications?
Okay, a lady by the name of Jeanette Lerman was the vice president of communications.
You indicated that you were in a department known as public affairs.
That's correct.
And who did you report to in public affairs?
Initially, right after the merger, there was a lady in Detroit by the name of Ann Dieters, and she was my manager, and she reported to David Curry, who reported to Jeanette Lerman.
And where was Mr. Curry located?
He was located in Detroit.
So Mr. Curry in Detroit reported to Ms. Lerman in Bluebell.
That's correct. And Ann Dieters was in Detroit also, my supervisor.
After the merger, where were most of the executives of Unisys located?
Most of them were in Bluebell. One or two remained in Detroit.
What was considered the corporate headquarters?
Well, are you saying considered or called?
Well, you explain.
Okay, there is a difference here. I think most people considered that Bluebell was the corporate headquarters, but I think the corporate headquarters title went to Detroit, and corporate offices they were calling Bluebell.
Where were most of the employees located?
Most of the employees were in Bluebell.
Now, after the merger, were you the only public affairs representative in Bluebell?
Yes, I was.
And how many other public affairs representatives were there?
There were 3 or 4 in Detroit.
Now, what was your job duty as a public affair representative in Bluebell?
All right, I had a number of duties, and one of them had to do with contributions for the Philadelphia and surrounding areas. I received all of the requests from organizations, nonprofit organizations, and I had to review them and assess them and make a recommendation as to whether or not they should be included in our contributions budget. That was one of the responsibilities.
Were you the most familiar with the Philadelphia area of the public affairs employees?
Yes, I was.
And by the way, what was your title in this position?
I was told that my title was being changed to Project Manager Public Affairs.
Now, sticking to the contributions part of your job function, did that change in any way after the merger?
Well, the budget was out in Detroit, and so what I was doing was making recommendations for organizations to be included in that budget, but there was a lot more money to be spent right then, and we were able to add a larger number of organizations here, nonprofit organizations, to receive funds. We also got into the cultural organizations of the city, which was something that we hadn't done before.
You also mentioned, Mrs. Becker, United Way. Was this a major function that you performed?
Yes, it was. The United Way came under a different person every year. I had led the Bluebell campaign 2 years, so I was kind of a continuous resource that the people used to come to. But then when I became part of the communications department, we also did a special event for our employees during the United Way campaign. And what we did was we signed up employees who wanted to go on a walk to raise a certain amount of money for an organization within United Way that they were interested in, that they had a special interest in. And what we did was we hired a band. And we took these people out on the streets up in Bluebell to walk around while the band was playing. And then we had refreshments for them after it was over. But we also had a week's amount of events happening. We had coffee and donuts one day in the cafeteria.
When was this?
This is in 1986 and 87?
No, it was 1987.
1987.
Yes, and 88
Okay,
also. 1987 and 1988. And we had other events, contests, things like that, that kept the United Way image in front of our employees for the period of time, for a week. And then the pledge cards were gathered in, and we had a goal to meet, and hopefully.
So this is done while you're part of Unisys?
Yes.
Did you also have employee events responsibilities?
Yes, I did. There were a number of employee events. In fact, there were almost monthly employee events staged in the Philadelphia area for not only the Bluebell employees, but for employees in surrounding areas, out on the 202 corridor and our Philadelphia office. Everybody was invited to be a part of these events. We had a very big one at the Thanksgiving Day parade, and we used the Franklin Institute as our headquarters, and we had balloons and we had refreshments, and our people could come and go from the Franklin Institute because it was usually very cold for the parade.
Is it all the detail necessary?
Your Honor, actually, we're just about to move on to another topic.
All right.
I just wanted to cover this basis.
I mean, is that like representative of the sort of events that you were involved in?
Yes,
That's
Your
like
Honor.
a representative
Yes, Your
example,
Honor.
is that right?
Yes.
Right.
Now, Mrs. Becker, after Unisys was formed and you worked under Ms. Dieters and then Mr. Curry, did you have any occasions where you would take these people from Detroit and show them the Philadelphia area?
Yes, I did. I accompanied both Mr. Curry and, Ann Dieters left the company shortly after the merger, and she had a replacement, but both she and her replacement and Mr. Curry I went with to visit different places in the area.
When Ms. Dieters, did she leave Unisys?
Yes, she did.
Were you offered the job that she had?
No, I wasn't.
Who was offered that job?
Carol Wilgen, who had been the manager of the library in Detroit, was offered that job.
And she was offered that job by Mr. Curry?
That's correct.
Did Ms. Wilgen have any experience in public affairs?
Sustained. Objection sustained.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, at this time, as you've testified, there was public affairs activities occurring in the Bluebell area and public affairs activities stemming out of Detroit. And would you explain to the members of the jury how the two sites would interact?
We had a number of interactions. We tried to make the events in both places as similar as we could. For instance, if we had one at the Art Museum here, they would have one out there at the Art Museum. And there were many similarities, and there were things that we did for each other. They would do a flyer for me. I would do some distribution of tickets for them, or go to one of their organizations here if they needed somebody from the area rather than have them fly in from Detroit.
Did there come a time when you received a review from Mr. Curry in or about January of 1988?
I think my review was Miss Wilden.
Was it a skip-level review?
Oh, the skip-level review. Yes, I did.
And would you explain to the members of the jury what transpired at that time?
Well, David Curry and Carol Wilgen invited me to accompany them to a conference room in Bluebell. And when we got into the room and sat down, they talked a little bit about what had been happening in the last year, and then they asked me how I felt about the first full year. Now, this was 1988, because that would be right after the first full year, which was 87. And I said to Mr. Curry, I said, I think it's important for me to know how you feel about what I've done, rather than me tell you how I feel about what is happening. And I didn't get a response. And then he said to me, let's pretend that Carol Wilgen's not here in the room, and why don't you talk to me as if she isn't here? Well, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Now, at that time, were you busy in Bluebell?
I certainly was. I was so busy, I asked him during this meeting to get me some help. And he thought about that for a bit, and Carol Wilgen said, there's no way you're going to get any help. I had more than I could handle. And he said, we'll see what we can do. Maybe we can get some help to you.
Now, after this skip review meeting in January of 1988, did you have a conversation with Mr. Curry in April of 88 concerning you working part-time?
Mr. Curry called me on the phone one day from Detroit, which was very unusual because he didn't call at all. And he said to me, in view of some of the job actions that are happening out here in Detroit, I would like to know whether you would consider going to a part-time position. Now, this was after I had asked him for help because I was so busy. So there was no way in the world I could consider, for a number of reasons, there was no way I could consider a part-time position.
Now, in the time period of approximately July of 1988, did a part-time employee come to Bluebell?
Marlene Wojcik, who had worked 2 days a week in Detroit in the Public Affairs Department, came to Bluebell. Her husband had been a lawyer, and he was transferred to Bluebell. And she accompanied him, and she was given a 3-day-a-week job working with me. And I assumed that was the help that I had been offered.
She was transferred from Detroit to Bluebell?
That's correct.
Did you help train Ms. Wojcik?
I helped train her because she wasn't familiar at all with what was going on in Philadelphia. We worked very closely together.
And what was your relationship like with Ms. Wojcik?
We got along beautifully, absolutely beautifully. It was almost like a mother-daughter relationship.
Now, in November of 1988, were you asked to visit public affairs in Detroit?
Yes, I was.
And who asked you to do that?
It would have been Carol Wilgen.
And what did you do when you visited Detroit?
One of the things, well, first of all, we had a staff meeting. We had maybe a couple of staff meetings a year. Since I was the only remote staff, I would go to Detroit and meet with them out there, and we would review everything. And after our staff meeting was over, Carol suggested to me that I sit down with the other people who worked in public affairs and talk to them about what I did and talk to them about what they did, what their jobs were. And after we were all done, it was obvious to me that I was doing some of the same things that each of them were doing.
Well, that's a personal observation she made. I'll let that stand. Objection overruled.
Thank you.
You can cross-examine as to that.
At this time, Pat Zilke was an associate public affairs specialist. Is that
Yes,
right?
she was.
And who else held that position?
Okay. Debbie Llewellyn and Jackie Mike.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention to the time period of January of 1989. As of that time, did you have any idea that your job was in any way in jeopardy?
Not at all. Not at all. There were several reasons why I did not have any idea that it was in jeopardy. In December, Jeanette Lerman had a Christmas party for the communications department, and it was held at the William Penn Inn, which is on Route 202 in our area, out in the Bluebell area. And I got to talk to her, which was an unusual occurrence. And I told her how wonderful I thought one of the jobs that she had started in Bluebell was, and that was she had a number of executives' wives in for lunch to Bluebell and to get to know them. And she said to me, I'd like you to continue this program from now on. Take it, pick up the ball on it and continue it. So that was in December of 1988.
Now, on January 4th, 1989, did you have a visit with Dr. McKenna?
Yes, I did. I had bronchitis, and I went to Dr. McKenna, and he said, as long as you're here, let's do part of your annual physical. And in examining my breasts, he found a suspicious lump.
Did you then have a mammogram performed the next day?
Yes, I did. He called over to the hospital and had them set up a mammogram appointment right away the next day, and I went and had the mammogram done.
And as you understood it, were the results of Dr. McKenna's exam and the mammogram suspicious of cancer?
Yes, the doctor told me. He called me on the phone and said it appears to be cancer.
Did you let Unisys know of this fact?
Every day that something happened, I told Carol Wilgen what was going on. Every day.
Now, as of this time, you indicated earlier you did not have any concern of your job being taken away. Isn't that correct?
Not at all. Not at all.
What was this time like for you from an emotional standpoint?
It was devastating. You can't imagine what it's like to hear that you have cancer. It's just something that you can't even imagine. I was devastated. I had to call on most of my inner resources to go on and to do my work and do what I had to do.
You continued to work, is that
Yes,
correct?
I did. Yes, I did.
Now, did you have a performance review performed in January of 1989?
Yes, yes, I did. In the middle of January 16th or 17th, on January 16th, Carol Wilgen came in from New York and sat down with Marlene and me to discuss our plans for everything that was happening for that year. We presented her with our plan for the Detroit area, special events for the employees, and for the Bluebell area, and how much it was going to cost, and she approved it and said, go ahead and start doing it. She also wanted a certain amount of visiting of the other locations in the area to be done to find out whether or not we were meeting their needs as far as contributions go. And
Your Honor, I have an exhibit book, and with Your Honor's permission, I would like to show this to the witness.
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Excuse me. Mrs. Becker, I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P9. And referring specifically to the third page of that document, there's a date of January 16, 1989. Do you see what I'm referring to?
yes, I do.
Would you explain what this document is?
What this document is an evaluation of what I had been doing in the past year by my manager, and it is something that we discussed before it's formalized.
And do the various activities that are set forth in this document reflect the type of work that you were doing at Unisys at that time?
Yes, they do.
Now, referring your attention to the bottom paragraph, was there at that time so much work and so many other jobs that you were being assigned that you had difficulty completing that which you wanted to complete?
Yes, there was, but it was agreed upon between Carol Wilgen and I that the volunteer programs would be put off to a future date when we had more time. One of the one of my goals for the year.
When did you actually receive this document?
I received it just before I left the company because I signed it the day I received it, and it's March 31st. Carol Wilgen signed it March 29th.
And March 31st was your last day at Unisys?
That was my last day worked.
Now, did there come a time when you learned that Unisys was offering a voluntary retirement incentive program?
Yes, I was working in my cubicle on the end of January 31st, when Donnie Upman, who was the director of HR for the group that I was in, the large group I was in, popped his head into my office and kind of did some chit-chat, and I had never had this happen before. In fact, I'd see him in the hall and he usually would just pass by without talking, although I knew him and he knew me. And he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I guess you've heard my news, but how are you doing?" Because I had heard also that he had cancer, and we talked a little bit about that. And then the subject of the early retirement, which had just been announced that day, came up. And in talking about it, I said, I cannot believe that all these decisions that I have to make are happening right now. I can't believe it. But I said there are some things, some pieces of information that I need before I could make an educated decision on this particular thing. Although I knew what my thoughts would be anyway, because I knew what my life plans were. And he said, "Well, what is it you need to know?" And I said, "Supposing I'm on sick leave, I was due to go into the hospital the following week for my operation. Supposing I'm on sick leave when the last eligible date for signing up for this comes along, what do I do?" And then the other thing was that he mentioned about the early, or the medical plan, which was also another area that had to have a decision made on, and stressed that it was so much more expensive than the Sperry plan would be. If you left the early retirement, you got to keep the Sperry plan, and it would cost you this much versus this much for the Unisys plan if you stayed on. There was an economic effect there. So he didn't have the answers to the questions that I asked him. And he said, "I'll research these and I'll get back to you." And that was where we left it.
Now, Mrs. Becker, you indicated in your testimony that at that time you knew what your life plan was. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yes. There was no way financially that I was planning on leaving the company early. I had 7 children, as I mentioned to you, and several of them went to college, and several of them got married, and all of these things take a lot of money. And we hadn't been able to worry about our own future in retirement. And the years that I was looking at coming forward were the ones that I was going to use for that purpose.
And you mentioned Mr. Upman, and Mr. Upman was in Human Resources, is that correct?
That's correct.
I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P16, please. Exhibit P16 is an announcement on the VRIP program, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the date of that is January 31st, 1989?
This was the document that Mr. Upman and I were looking at when we had our discussion.
Now, in the second paragraph, it states information concerning eligible employees must be age 58 with 15 years of pensionable service as of March 31st, 1989. Did you meet that requirement?
Yes, I did.
It then goes on to state that also eligible employees must make an election no later than March 15, 1989, and retire effective no later than April 1st, 1989. Last day worked no later than March 31st, 1989. Would you explain what you understood that paragraph to mean?
Well, there was a deadline of March 15th that you had to sign your papers and get them to your human resource person, or you weren't going to be eligible for the program. And once you did that, you had to retire by April 1st, 1989, which was 2 weeks later.
Now, as of this meeting with Mr. Upman, had you ever had discussions with Mr. Upman where you indicated you were interested in taking retirement?
I had no discussions with Mr. Upman ever about anything before this.
To the best of your knowledge, did he have any reason to believe that you were interested in taking early retirement?
I don't know how he could have believed that, because it wasn't so.
Were you aware of some individuals at Unisys who were interested?
Oh yes, there were a number of people around, one of them being Dick Robertson, who was one of the vice presidents, vice president of special projects in communications department. He was interested in not only his own retirement, but who else was also going to retire. He was always interested in, like, have you heard this or have you heard that about so-and-so?
Now, you mentioned at the same time Unisys decided to change its post-retirement medical benefits for certain employees, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about that. First, if you could turn to Exhibit P17, please. This is a document, two-page document, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And this document refers to the change in the program. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would you please tell the members of the jury what you understood the change in the program to mean?
Well, the most important change for those people who were eligible for the early out had to do with economics. Under the Sperry plan, which the people from Sperry were still covered by, their post-retirement medical, meaning for themselves, for the rest of their lives, would not cost anything. It was zero. If they covered a spouse, it would be $2.25 for the spouse, which was a very good rate. It's a wonderful rate. Now, the new plan that was coming into play, the Unisys plan that would go into place after April 1st, was going to cost $40 for an individual a month, and then I think $35 for a spouse. So that was a significant increase in cost.
And according to this document marked P17, the date where it takes effect, that is where the more expensive medical plan kicks in, is that same April 1st date?
That's that same April 1st date.
And to try to clarify this then, if you worked April 2nd and then were told you were laid off on April 2nd, you'd lose your old benefits as you understood it.
That's correct.
Now, after meeting with Mr. Upman on January 31st, 1989, and having the discussion that you testified to, did you then have occasion to meet with Mr. Upman again?
Well, the next morning, I had to go to the hospital for, I had to see the radiotherapist, the person who decides whether or not you can have radiation treatments, because everybody's skin isn't the same, and how many you would need to try to kill the cancer that's growing within you even after they have taken it out. And when I came back, there was a note on my desk saying, "See me at 2 o'clock, Donnie." Yes.
And that's Mr. Upman?
That's correct.
All right. Did you then meet with Mr. Upman on or about February 2nd?
February 2nd at 2 o'clock, I went over to his office, which was maybe 50 feet or so from where I worked. And I went in and sat down, and we did a little bit of chit-chat, and he told me that he had found out some answers to my questions on the timing, if I were out on sick leave or somebody else were out on sick leave, whether or not they would hold that option for the retirement or for the post-retirement medical. And then he got up and closed the door. He went over and closed the door. And he said, what I really called you here for today was not to talk about this, but to talk about reorganization. And I thought, reorganization, what does that have to do with me? And he said, in 3 weeks, your job function is being transferred to Bluebell, or to Detroit. Your job function and the job function of Marlene Wojcik is being transferred to Detroit. And I jumped up and I said, I can't believe this is happening. I mean, this is one more thing that's happening at the same time that I'm trying to deal with the horror of learning that I have cancer. And I said, are you trying to tell me I'm going to be laid off in 3 weeks? He said, unless you take the early retirement, you're being laid off in 3 weeks. And I restated it several different ways, and it came back always the same. Unless you take the early retirement, you are going to be laid off in 3 weeks.
What was your reaction to that?
I have never been so stunned in my life. I could not believe this was happening. I was so busy and so into what I was doing, and we were right in the middle of a program, an event that was going on. I just couldn't believe that this was happening. I was shocked to death. Shocked to death.
Now, as of this meeting on February 2nd, had you already had cancer surgery scheduled?
Yes, my cancer surgery was scheduled for February 7th. This was the 2nd. And it was a Thursday.
And what was your schedule like for the Friday?
On Friday, I had to go to the hospital to have a bone scan done and an EKG and blood work done. That was for Friday.
Now, Mr. Upman at this time was not in any way in the chain of command for you, is that correct?
No, he wasn't. He was the human resource person for the group.
You indicated that you worked down the hall from him?
Just around the corner from him.
How far did you work from Jeanette Lehrman, who was the Vice President of Communications?
Well, Mr. Upman's office was around the corner to the left, and her office was around the corner to the right.
Did she talk to you about what was happening to your job?
Not at all. Not in the least.
Now, on February 3rd, that Friday, you indicated you had tests. Did you go to work the Monday, the day before your cancer surgery?
Yes, I did. I came into work on Monday, and Carol Wilgen flew in from Detroit to have a meeting with me and with Marlene to reiterate what Donnie Upman had said to us. And as a matter of fact, Marlene wasn't in the day that he said it because she only worked 3 days a week, so she found out about it on that Monday. And she borrowed an office from someone, and she and I went into the office, and she said, do you know why I'm here? And I said, yes, Donnie told me that I was going to be laid off in 3 weeks unless I took the early retirement. And she said, what are you going to do? And I said, do I have a choice? And she just shrugged her shoulder and didn't say yes or no. I had a choice. I obviously did not have a choice.
Did you have any discussion with Ms. Wilgen about your returning to work after cancer surgery?
After this, I said to her, I had talked to Donnie Upman about it, that probably there would be a period of time after I had recuperated from my operation when I could come back to work before the 31st of March, which would be my last day worked. And he said, we'll talk about that at another time. There really wasn't too much definite. He kind of said, well, yes, I guess there is, and that'd be okay, but it wasn't real clear. But I said to Carol Wilgen that I had the same thing. I had a period of time that I would be able to come back to work, and she said, no. Oh, you're not coming back to work. And I said, I think you better talk to Donnie Upman. And the meeting broke up, and she went to see Donnie Upman, and she came back to my cubicle and said, yes, you can come back to work until the 31st of March.
Were you then admitted to the hospital for a cancer surgery?
Early Tuesday morning, February 7th, I was admitted to the hospital for cancer surgery.
And what hospital was that?
That was Montgomery Hospital in Norristown.
And as of the time when you were going in for the surgery, was there any doubt in your mind that you were going to lose your job?
There was no doubt in my mind that I was going to lose my job. None.
And how did you feel at that time?
I felt lower than a worm, is how I felt. Lower than a worm.
Briefly, what was the surgery?
Well, there was a choice of surgeries. The doctor left it up to my husband and me to decide whether to have what they call a lumpectomy, which is where they cut your breast and take the bad tissue and then surrounding tissue out, and they also cut under your armpit and take your lymph nodes out. That is called a lumpectomy, or to have a mastectomy, to have your breast removed, and they also would take out the lymph nodes under your arm. And there are different treatments afterward. For the lumpectomy, you had to have radiation, and I had 38 radiation treatments. And with the mastectomy, you usually have chemotherapy and sometimes radiation, but mostly chemotherapy.
You then returned home after the hospital stay?
Yes, I did.
Did you then write a letter to Mr. Upman confirming what he had told you?
Yes, I did. On February 21st, I wrote to him and I said, in view of the fact that you told me I was going to be laid off in 3 weeks, now the time is spinning out here. If I didn't take the early retirement, would you please send me the necessary papers that I need to sign up for the early retirement?
And if you would look, please, at Exhibit P26. Is this a copy of the letter that you sent to Mr. Upman?
Yes, it is.
Did you receive a response from Mr. Upman?
Yes, I did.
And if I could direct your attention to Exhibit P27, is that the response from Mr. Upman?
Yes, it is.
Now, directing your attention back to Exhibit P26, would you read for the members of the jury what you wrote to Mr. Upman in this letter?
All right, I said, Dear Donnie, in view of the fact that I have been told by both you and Carol Wilgen to take the early retirement package or be laid off in 3 weeks from when you and I met in your office on February 2nd, 1989, I request that you send me the necessary forms that need to be filled out for the retirement package. As requested earlier, please obtain for me a Part B estimate using the information that I provided by telephone. I have not yet been released by the surgeon for return to work and will advise you as soon as this happens. And it's signed by me.
Did you copy this document to Ms. Wilgen?
Yes, I did. It's carbon copy to Carol Wilgen.
And this letter then was within that 3-week time period from February 2nd, correct?
Yes, it was.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P27, which is Mr. Upman's response. And could you read this letter for the jury, please?
All right, it says, Dear Bunny, attached is the savings plan annuity estimate that you requested. It is my understanding that Lali Palekia has spoken to you and that you may schedule a VRIP counseling session with her after your additional estimates are received. I was surprised by the opening of your 221 letter. I don't recall mentioning anything about your being laid off. I did say that the public affairs function in Bluebell was being closed down. I also tried to explain how the early retirement program would work when someone was on short-term disability. That is, you had to be back to work, even if you were on a part-time basis, before March 31st in order to protect your entitlement to the Sperry post-retirement medical benefit, as opposed to Unisys post-retirement medical, after 4/189, which is more costly.
Now, if I could just stop you there for 1 second and refer you back to the statement where he states, I don't recall mentioning anything about your being laid off. Is that a true statement?
No, it is not.
Objection, Your Honor, move to strike.
Well, all right, I think what the witness is saying is that her version is that he did say that, and he's expressing himself that he didn't. I don't think she's saying he didn't say this, what he said in the letter. They have a difference as to where that topic was mentioned, so I'll let that answer. Is that your understanding, Mrs. Becker?
Yes, it is.
That February 2nd meeting, the topic of layoff was mentioned. That's your testimony?
That's my
All
testimony.
right, and Mr. Upman apparently in his letter said he doesn't recall that being a topic, so I'll let it stand that way. All right, objection overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Well, do you want to finish reading that letter?
Sure, Your Honor.
All right, the last paragraph is, my purpose in addressing the closure of public affairs here in Bluebell was motivated simply by what I deemed to consider fair treatment. I felt it was better to advise you of that action before it was announced rather than for you to be advised at home, by phone, at a later date. I'm sorry this was interpreted as an effort to apply pressure on you. It was merely relating a fact that I felt you should be aware of. Sincerely.
I'm sorry. Did you, in fact, when you had this conversation with Mr. Upman, feel that you were being pressured into retirement?
His office felt like a pressure chamber. He kept saying, unless you take the early retirement, unless you take the early retirement. Just felt like a pressure chamber.
Would this be a good time for a brief recess?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, member of the jury, we'll take a brief recess. You may step in the jury room for a few minutes. Thank you. You may step down, Ms. Becker.
Thank you.
Recess, about 10 minutes, thanks. Very much. You may be seated. Thank you. You may be seated. All right, member of the jury, you've asked to take notes, and of course you're permitted to do so. Just let me make one or two observations about that. First of all, the notes that you take must stay here. That is, when you leave, just leave them with Miss Garangelli, and she'll place them in an envelope with your name on. Then tomorrow you'll get them back. Secondly, I would just caution you a little bit about the extent to which you may take notes. Don't be so distracted with keeping your own notes that you may be missing something that's taking place here. All right? That's just something that each of you will do in keeping with your own method that you have. But as these witnesses testify, and as the lawyers question them, a lot takes place through that questioning process that juries perceive as jurors in trying to determine what happened and what was said and what's reliable and what's not. So if you're taking a lot of notes, you may be missing something. So I'm just saying, just make a fair balance. And then, of course, you do understand that your notes, of course, are not the evidence. It's your version of what you think a particular event was. So with that, if you will, cautionary suggestion, any of you who are taking notes now, you can continue to take, or you can decide not to. Or if somebody is not taking them now, just let Ms. Garangelli know, and we'll make sure you get a pad and a clipboard and pencil. All right. So with that, let's pick up where we left off. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Becker, did there come a time when you then filled out a voluntary retirement form and sent it back to Unisys?
Yes, I did.
And I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P20, please. Would you explain to the members of the jury what P20 is?
P20 is one of the forms to be filled out for the incentive, the retirement incentive program, and it tells you to check one thing, how you want your pension paid, but it also starts out by saying, I am voluntarily electing to participate in the Unisys Voluntary Retirement Incentive Program. And I crossed out the voluntarily because I was not voluntarily doing this.
You then sent this form into Unisys, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And then there came a time, actually before this, when you actually returned to work, isn't that right?
On the 28th of February, I returned to work.
Now, you then worked for approximately 1 month?
That's correct.
In that 1 month period, when you returned to work,
no, he didn't. I never saw Donnie again, but I have to go back and tell you one other thing. Rudy Nearing did stop me in the hall and tell me that Mike Losey, who was a vice president of Human Resources, would talk to me about my options that I would select for the retirement.
Did there come a time when you had a meeting with Mr. Losey?
Yes, there did.
At the time when you filled out when you sent the letter, to Mr. Upman, did you also file a charge of discrimination based on age and cancer?
Yes, I did. In February, I filed a charge with the Human Relations Commission for discrimination based on age and cancer.
Now, after you returned to Unisys, did you ever have a meeting with anyone to discuss your charge of discrimination?
Yes, I did. I received a call on March 15th from Dermot White, and Dermot is an attorney with Unisys, and he asked me to meet with him and with Mike Losey in Mike Losey's office the following day, which would be the 16th of March.
Did you go to that meeting?
Yes, I did.
And what happened at the meeting?
Well, it was interesting. I came in and sat down, and both of these men were there. They closed the door. And Dermot White started the meeting off. He carried the ball, and he said, we're here today to discuss the complaint that you filed against Unisys. Now, he said, I'm not concerned about this claim at all. He said, I've handled many of them, and I've never lost a case. And Mr. Losey said, wait a minute, Dermot, we've settled some out of court. So then he went on and he said, we really wish you would withdraw this complaint. So then Mr. Losey started by saying, he picked up the ball then, and he said, we would like you to consider being a consultant for Unisys. And what that would mean would be that you could walk out of here without a cloud over your head after all the years that you represented Unisys in this community, and without a cloud over Unisys' head. And then he continued, and he said, what we would like you to do is to work with the United Way in Philadelphia for 3 weeks this year and 3 weeks next year, and we'll pay you $2,500 a year. And then he said, is that all that we're going to offer to you to settle? No, probably not. Then after that, there was some more discussion.
Did you accept the offer?
I told them I would get back to them.
Did you ever get back to them?
No, I didn't. I didn't think it was a serious offer.
Now, after you returned to Unisys in March, did you commence your radiation treatment?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
After you returned to Unisys in March of '89, did you commence your radiation treatment?
Yes, I did, and I had 38 radiation treatments, 28 of them at Montgomery Hospital, and then a period of time when they give you to recover a little bit because it's a progressive thing, and then I had 10 more treatments at Fox Chase Center.
Object and move to strike this line of questioning. It's irrelevant.
Well, I'll let it stand.
Thank you.
Overruled.
What was your last day of work at Unisys?
March 31st, 1989.
Were you ever offered another job by anyone at Unisys other than that consulting discussion you had?
No, I was not.
I'd like to refer your attention to Patricia Zilke, and she's a public affairs representative. And if I could, I'd like you to turn to Exhibit P14. Exhibit P14 is what, Mrs. Becker?
P14 is the job description for Patricia Zilke with the title Associate Public Affairs Rep.
And Mrs. Zilke was one of the individuals who was working out of Detroit?
That's correct.
Did you learn at some point in time that Mrs. Zilke chose the retirement package?
Yes, I did.
Now, I'd like you to please read the responsibilities of Mrs. Zilke.
All right, to coordinate corporate community outreach program as tied to the contributions program for the Detroit area, develop consistent model with Blue Bell program, oversee promotional activities for corporate-wide United Way campaigns, launch corporate-wide volunteerism program using Detroit and Blue Bell as trial sites, prepare policy and guidelines and develop administrative systems for volunteerism program, ascertain information, publish and maintain executive involvement roster, assist in assessing the community relations programs for 1988. And
now, if I could just stop you for a second and go back over these. First, the first item there makes reference to the developing a consistent model with Blue Bell program. Would you tell us what that is?
well, that was what I was doing in Blue Bell by reaching out to the community. I don't believe there was much of that going on in the Detroit area.
In connection with all of these duties listed under Ms. Silke's job performance, were you qualified to do those activities?
Yes, sir.
I'll let her render her opinion. Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, I was qualified to do her job.
And why is that?
Because each of these things that she has listed here as job responsibilities are things that were being done by either me or me and Marlene Wojcik.
Now, referring down onto this document under the heading General, would you read those 3 items that are listed there?
All right, these are the general items. Continue to provide information services, that is, press releases and product brochures, to the International Advisory Board, Senior Advisory Board, and the Board of Directors. Maintain centralized records for corporate-wide community relations programs. Work closely with Ed.Becker on implementation and administration of community relations programs.
Now, in connection with that last statement, which is right on her job description, which makes reference to you, Mrs. Becker, would you explain what that is in regards to?
Well, it has to do with the community relations program that was established in Bluebell, and I assume that this means that Pat Zilke was...
Sustained. Objection sustained. Is there a date on this?
This is a document I received.
Description?
No, Your Honor, I do not have a date. I received it from Unisys without a date.
Right.
Now, Mrs. Becker, I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P37. And Exhibit P37 is a March 1st, 1989 memo from Mr. Curry to Rudolph Nearing. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Now, in connection with this particular document, would you explain to the jury what this document is referring to?
Objection, Your Honor.
Well, I'll let her give a general topical description of what it is. It's very lengthy, and we can't read all these papers, so I'll let her give what she believes the general message is intended to convey.
Thank you.
My understanding of this document is that Pat Zilke out in Detroit had elected the early retirement, and therefore Mr. Curry was going to shift somebody into her job from Detroit, somebody from Detroit into her job.
And she was in Detroit?
That's correct.
All right.
Now, Mrs. Becker, is there any reason from your experience why you could not have done those job duties that Ms. Zilke was handling in Detroit?
None whatsoever.
Did anyone ever approach you with the possibility of moving to Detroit, even if you were to do it at your expense?
No, they didn't.
Based on your knowledge, was Ms. Wojcik transferred from Detroit to Bluebell?
Yes, she was.
Were there other transfers from Detroit to Bluebell?
Yes, there were.
I'd like to direct your attention next to Exhibit P39. And with Your Honor's permission, I have a blow-up of this particular chart, which I would put on the easel.
All right.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I object to the witness testifying about this document unless there's first some foundation laid that she knows what it is or authored it or something like that.
All right. You have to lay the foundation to her knowledge about what this is. And then she can testify to it if she has a sufficient understanding of it.
Well, Mrs. Becker, what is your understanding as to what Exhibit P39 is?
That
Overruled.
this is an organizational chart for the public affairs.
And why do you tell me why you believe that that's what that is?
I'm sorry.
What's the basis of your saying that? Why do you believe it's that?
Because it has the 4 segments of the department in Detroit, public affairs, and each person's responsibility underneath the segment.
And lastly, where did this come from? Maybe you know.
This was produced by defendants in this case.
Right. Well, that's her belief of what it is. I'll let her testify to it, and she can be cross-examined.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Objection overruled.
Now, Mrs. Becker, the date of this document is April 7th, 1989. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if we look under the first category on the far left, the name of Ms. Wilgen appears. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that the same Ms. Wilgen you've been speaking about?
That is correct, Your Honor.
And then there's a title, Project Manager Public Affairs. Was that the position you held?
That was my job title, and there was only one of them when I was there.
And underneath that job title is the name L.D. Oberzut. Who was L.D. Oberzut?
Miss Oberzut was the lead person in the library in Detroit.
As of the time when you left Unisys, was Miss Oberzut in public affairs?
She was not.
Do you know approximately how old Miss Oberzut is or was at the time?
I've heard that she's in her 30s.
Now, the other individuals listed under Miss Oberzut's names are Miss Llewellyn, Miss Mikey, and Miss Plohetsky. Miss Llewellyn and Miss Mikey you testified about. They were the public affairs representatives when you were there, correct?
That's correct.
And Miss Zilke's name does not appear, correct?
That's correct.
The name of L. Plohetsky appears under co-op. What does co-op mean?
Co-op usually means a student, a school student who works part-time and goes to school part-time.
And if I could direct your attention upward, there's a secretarial slot there for Chris Krupka. You see what I've referred to?
Yes, I do.
Was that position there at the time you were laid off?
I don't believe it was.
Objection sustained. Can't guess at this. If she knows, we'd like her to tell us, but her surmise or just what she may have learned through rumor is not sufficient. So objection sustained.
Mrs. Becker, I'd like to next direct your attention to Exhibit P36. Excuse me. This is a February 13, 1989 memo from Mr. Curry. You see what I'm referring to?
Yes, I do.
And in the first paragraph, under your name, it states that the employee will presumably elect early retirement. Based on your discussions with Mr. Curry and your interaction with Mr. Curry, did he have any basis to make that assumption as of February 13?
Objection sustained.
Did you have any discussions with Mr. Curry that addressed that issue?
I did not.
I'd like to direct your attention to the second page of this document. And first, the name Lorraine Oberzut appears again. And underneath that is the name Jane Ferre. And I'd like to just read to you the note made by Mr. Curry. If Oberzut declines...
Your Honor, I want to object unless there's some basis for this witness to have testified on this document. There's no foundation.
All right, what's the offer?
Your Honor, Mrs. Becker would testify as to what Jane Ferre did, and I'm just laying
Well, why don't you
some
just ask her
background.
that? What did Jane Ferre do? That's the best thing. Objection sustained.
Thank you. Mrs. Becker, who is Jane Ferre?
Jane Ferre was formerly a member of the library staff out in Detroit.
Was she a part-time or full-time employee?
She had been full-time, but then she had a baby and became part-time.
And as of the date when you left Unisys, was she a part-time employee?
Yes, she was.
I'd like to refer your attention next to Marlene Wojcik, and I know you've testified to some extent about her. If I could ask you to look at Exhibit P15, please. Do you have before you P15?
Yes, I do.
And what is P15?
P15 is the position description for Marlene Wojcik with the title Associate Public Affairs Rep, part-time, 24 hours a week.
And would you directing your attention to the last heading of general there, would you just read what is stated under that?
I'm going to object to testimony about this document unless there's a time frame provided and some reason to believe this witness knows something about this document.
Well, it looks like it was before 1988. Is that the time period we're concerned with? There's a date in here that says assist in the special events for 1988, so presumably this was before that.
Right.
Well, what's your offer? Your offer is...
Your Honor, it makes reference to the fact that even though Ms. Wojcik is in Detroit at the time, her job duties also include working in the Bluebell area.
Prior to 1988?
That's right, prior to her even being transferred.
All right. I'll offer it on that basis.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Becker, would you read the last line there, please?
Right, as a general duty, to work closely with Edmunda Becker to ensure program consistency in Bluebell area.
Now, after Ms. Wojcik came to Bluebell and you worked with her, what was in general the workload like for the two of you as of the first quarter of 1989?
We were involved in a project in January, the poetry project. We had a contest for our employees' children, and that was our big project for the month. But we had more work than we could handle. We had more work.
And as of this time period, the time period when you found out you had cancer and you met with Mr. Upman, did you know a Cheryl McCauley?
Yes, I knew Cheryl very well.
Where was she located in connection with your desk?
Cheryl's cubicle was on the other side of my...
So she was right next to you?
Right.
And approximately how old is Miss McCauley?
I'd say she's in her late 30s.
And was she in communications?
Yes, she was.
Now, as of this time period, from what you observed, was Miss McCauley busy?
No, she wasn't. There were days and weeks when Cheryl didn't have any work to do.
No work at all?
Nothing.
Was she laid off?
No, she wasn't. Not at that time.
Now, the type of work...
What time period was that?
That was in the first quarter of 1989.
Okay, first 3 months of 1989, right?
Correct, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Now, Mrs. Becker, the type of work that you were doing for Unisys, based on your knowledge of it, was it the type of work that after you left someone else would have to pick up?
Yes, it certainly was. If the projects were to continue for the employees, it would have to be picked up by other people.
I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P13, please. This document appears to make reference to an event that is going to take place on September 10th of 1989. This is after you left Unisys, correct?
That's correct.
Would you explain the type of document this is and how this related to the type of work you did?
This is a flyer that was made up to tell our employees what was going to happen at the Philadelphia Museum of Art on September 10th, 1989. And refreshments were going to be served. There was going to be a lecture and slideshow. And it was a limited number of tickets available. And it was a flyer with a tear-off on the bottom that said, fill out your name and your mailing address and so on, and send it into Bluebell.
Is this the type of project that you had worked on?
Yes, it is.
And this document is to be returned to Bluebell, not Detroit.
It says Bluebell, Annenberg Exhibit, Mail Station S1 102, Bluebell.
I'd like to direct your attention next to Exhibit P12. This appears to pertain to an October 17, 1989 event, again after you left Unisys. Could you explain what this document is?
This has to do with the United Way walkathon that I had mentioned earlier about promotional event for employees where they walked around the community to a band and so on. And this This flyer says that if you have any questions about this event or need assistance with registration, contact Connie Wells in Bluebell on extension 3508.
And did you know Connie Wells?
Yes, I did.
And who was Connie Wells?
Connie Wells was a person who worked in HR.
In Bluebell?
Yes.
And lastly, as an example, I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit P11. This pertains to an event scheduled for March 21st, 1990. Would you tell the jury what this is?
All right. This is another employee event that says, come and meet the music, and it has to do with an event at the Academy of Music, again with a tear-off sheet at the bottom for the person to fill out their name and give their mailing address and say how many tickets they wanted at a certain reduced price, and mail it to Bluebell, mail station E2-112.
Now, for the type of work that you were performing as of the first quarter of 1989, the last 3 months you worked at Unisys, from what you were doing, was there any advantage to you being in Detroit?
There would be no advantage whatsoever for me to be in Detroit. None.
Why is that?
Because all of the organizations that we were dealing with are in this area. The Detroit people were dealing with the Detroit organizations.
And where were the major executives located?
Most of the top executives were in Bluebell.
Mrs. Becker, as of March 31st, 1989, your last day of work, what was your salary?
My salary was $43,600 a year.
And with that salary, did you receive full benefits?
Yes, I did.
And these were all of your health benefits?
That's correct.
Was there also a contribution being made to your pension plan?
Yes, there was.
Can you explain what that contribution system was?
Okay, there was a company paid pension plan, and then there was another savings plan that you could put a certain amount of money to, and the company would put some dollars to also.
Was there also a voluntary savings plan?
That was the voluntary savings plan.
Now, based on your 19 years of history with Sperry and then Unisys, did you anticipate a raise if you had remained at Unisys?
Yes, I did.
And could you tell us when you would anticipate a raise and the amount of the raise that you would anticipate?
When Carol Wilgen was in January of 1989 talking to Marlene and me, she mentioned the amount that was going for the year was between 4.5% and 5%, and that's what we could expect.
And when did you understand that that raise would be effective?
I understood it would be effective in April.
April 1st?
April 1st.
And based on your history again with Unisys, how often were you receiving raises over the years?
I had been receiving raises on a yearly basis, or if I got a promotion, I would receive a raise then. But there were some stretches going on about this time that could have been a year and a half.
Would a year and a half have been about the longest stretch without a raise?
Yes, it would have been.
And conservatively, what would be the least amount of the raise that you would expect?
5%.
When did you expect to work to, Mrs. Becker?
I had no time frame set in my mind. I was going to continue working as long as I was able to, and there was no set time in my mind for me to leave.
If you felt you had not been forced to take retirement, would you have taken retirement at Unisys?
No, I would not have.
Did you suffer financial losses as a result of leaving Unisys?
Certainly I did. I suffered the loss of my salary and also benefits.
Did you receive any severance at all when you left?
No, I did not receive any severance pay when I left.
As of the time when you left, were you the primary moneymaker in your family?
Yes, I was.
And as of the time when you left, did you have any dependent children living with you?
I have a son who is a college student, and we also have a retarded daughter.
And her name is Lisa?
That's correct.
And is she severely retarded?
Yes, she's severely retarded.
Do you therefore expect her to be financially dependent on you for the rest of her life?
That's correct.
After you stopped working at Unisys, I believe you testified that you continued to have radiation treatment through May of 1989, is that correct?
That is correct.
And how frequent were those treatments?
They were on a daily basis, Monday to Friday. There was one period of time when I was so burned they had to stop for a week. But altogether, there were 38 treatments.
What effect was it on you to stop working as of March 31st?
I was adrift. I didn't know which way to turn. I didn't know what to do. I lost socialization with my friends. I just was in limbo as far as who I was. I lost the structure of my life, my job structure, getting up and going to work and doing what I had to do in the evening and over the weekends.
What effect did the loss of the job have on your feeling of confidence?
I still have not recovered my confidence. I lost my confidence. When you're giving all you have to a job and this happens, this is something that damages your self-confidence.
Did there come a time, Mrs. Becker, when you were prescribed medication for depression?
Yes, there was. I had gotten pretty low, and I wasn't sleeping well, and I wasn't eating very well, and I wasn't doing anything very well. And the doctor ordered a mood-altering drug for me.
This is Dr. McKenna?
Yes, it was.
Did there also come a time when Dr. McKenna suggested that you see a psychologist?
Yes, there was.
And did you see a psychologist?
Yes, I did.
What time period was this?
That was in July of 1989.
What would you say was the lowest point for you from an emotional standpoint after you lost your job?
Well, I just couldn't bring myself up. I couldn't snap back up, and it was prolonged. It went on for a while.
Did there come a time when you did take on volunteer work?
The psychologist I went to see suggested that I first of all keep a journal every day of how I felt and what I was doing with myself, and then he also suggested that I do some volunteer work, and I did. I looked into it and I signed up for volunteer work at Montgomery Hospital.
What type of work did you do at Montgomery Hospital?
Okay, I work 1 day a week from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and what we do is move sick people who are on stretchers and wheelchairs from one part of the hospital to the other, if they have to go to the x-ray department or if they have to go to physical therapy or so on. And we talk to them on the way.
Do you get paid for this?
No, I don't.
Do you do any other types of volunteer work at the present?
Yes, I do. I volunteer also 1 day a week to visit the sick people from my church who are in the hospital and go and visit them.
And do you get paid for that?
No, I don't.
This feeling of depression or feeling low, as you indicated, what effect, if any, did that have on your ability to try to get another job?
Well, my confidence was rattled and shaken by this, and it was a long time before I could even think about maybe applying for a job. I kept my eyes open. I tried to see if there was anything in the paper that was like the job that I had. I couldn't find anything, and then I asked my friends and my family to find out if they were hiring in places where they worked, and I was not successful.
To this day, have you ever worked for wages since you left Unisys?
No, I have not.
To this day, do you feel that being forced out of your job has left an emotional impact on you?
Yes, I do. I certainly do. As I said, my confidence in myself has been shaken.
Thank you, Mrs. Becker. No further questions.
Cross-examine.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Becker.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ellis.
The first thing I'd like to ask you is a few questions about the last job you had when you were at Unisys. Now, I understand from your testimony that you thought this was important work, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I certainly did.
You were very proud of the work that you did.
Yes, I am. I still am proud of the work I did.
And you got along well with your supervisor, Mrs. Wilgen?
Yes, I did.
And just so we make sure we understand exactly what that job was, immediately before the merger between Sperry and Burroughs that occurred in 1986, your job was entirely that of a community relations person. Is that right?
I think it was broader than that, Mr. Ellis.
Well, when you say broader than that, what do you mean?
Well, it also encompassed the contributions in addition to community relations.
Oh, okay. So it would be the contributions and the employee events and all those things that go into the job that we call community relations.
That's correct.
Okay. So what I was getting at, though, is you did not have any employee benefit functions at that point?
No, I did not.
And you did not have any human resource functions at that point?
No, I did not.
So you didn't deal with pension plans anymore, did you?
No, I did not.
And you didn't deal with employee benefits matters?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, is the job that you had in community relations, primarily the purpose of that job was to enhance the image of Unisys in the community?
That was the way I viewed it.
Okay, you were supposed to project the positive image of the company, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And to do that, you worked a great deal with community groups, didn't you?
That's correct.
And you worked a great deal with organizations that wanted money out of Unisys, didn't you?
That is correct.
In fact, practically all the groups you worked with wanted money or were getting money out of Unisys at that time. Okay, let me clarify my time period. From the time of the merger on, I'm using the word Unisys as the merged company. But most of the organizations you worked with either wanted money or were getting money, right?
That is correct.
And you were known, at least in some parts, as the lady who gave out the money at Blue Bell, weren't you?
I suppose I was.
And you were referred to by people in the company as that, were you not?
I'm not aware of that, Mr. Ellis.
Well, do you recall telling me in your deposition that Ms. Lerman, Jeanette Lerman, introduced you once as the person who gave out the money?
That's one person, one time.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, let's, just so the jury understands what your job was, I'd like to talk a little bit more about it, not for real long, but just a little bit more so they get a good flavor of your job. Among the types of organizations that you dealt with would be, for example, the Girl Scouts, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that was a particular part of the Girl Scouts, wasn't it? In other words, a particular council within the Girl Scouts?
That's correct.
Particularly the Freedom Valley Girl Scouts?
That is correct.
And that's an organization that's headquartered in the Philadelphia area, isn't it?
That is correct.
And for the Girl Scouts, among other things, you arranged to sit on a task force.
That is correct.
And this is a task force that the Girl Scouts set up because they wanted people from the business community like yourself to help them get money out of United Way organizations, right?
No, that is not really so. What it was an advisory board. It was an advisory board. We did not try to get money out of other United Ways for them.
I'm sorry, I may have mischaracterized it. Your purpose on that board was to help advise the Girl Scouts on how best to get money for their organization.
How best to deal with the different United Ways. They were having some problems with the United Ways.
But the purpose of the United Way, of dealing with the United Way, was to obtain contributions, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, you did this in order to help enhance the image of your employer, Unisys, in the community, right?
That is correct.
Now, you also dealt with Delaware Valley Junior Achievement. Is that another good example?
That is correct.
And did Unisys give them money?
I don't believe we were giving them money.
Did you give them volunteers to help teach?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Yes, we did.
And did you deal with a group called Donors Forum?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And am I correct that Donors Forum is a group of persons from Philadelphia area companies that get together to discuss groups that want money on a charitable contribution basis?
That is so.
Okay, so that about once a month you would go to a meeting with your peers from other corporations in the Philadelphia area, right?
That is correct.
And you would discuss the various organizations that wanted money out of the big companies. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, you've discussed your participation in the Eastern State Hospitals program, where Unisys sponsored a trip to Dorney Park every year. And you found that very rewarding, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And do you remember when you talked about the United Way? You spent a great deal of time on the United Way, didn't you?
Specifically what, Mr. Ellis?
Well, on helping to run the Blue Belt portion of the Unisys United Way program.
The Unisys United Way program, yes, I did.
Now, among the duties you did for the United Way program would be setting up displays.
Yes.
And you would maintain that big red thermometer that gets put in the building, wouldn't you?
I didn't maintain them. Someone did.
Okay, and you made sure it was maintained right.
That is correct.
Okay, and you made sure that the flag that says United Way was flying from the top of the flagpole at Unisys, right?
Right. That is correct.
Now, you arranged to get people to come in and blow up balloons for the walkathon, right?
That is so.
Now, you also wrote reports on everything you did, and you sent them to Detroit, right?
That is so.
Okay. Now, in addition to all these organizations you dealt with, you also went to a lot of meetings, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And in fact, you'd go to maybe 6 or 8 or 10 meetings a month on behalf of Unisys.
That is correct.
And an example of that would be the Donors Forum meetings, right?
That is so.
Okay, and you would go to meetings where the company received awards from community groups, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would.
And all of this was done in order to enhance the company's image in the Blue Bell and the Philadelphia area, right?
That is so.
Now, from your long experience with the company and your lifetime, you have lived in Philadelphia your entire life, correct?
Philadelphia and the suburbs.
Yeah, that's what I meant, Philadelphia, the greater Philadelphia area.
That's correct.
You got to know some of these groups very well, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Now, your husband also is from the Philadelphia area, isn't he?
Yes.
Okay, and he has been employed by the state of Pennsylvania?
Correct.
And you've never dealt with the community groups in Michigan, have you?
No, I haven't.
In fact, you've never dealt with them outside the Philadelphia area, have you?
No, that's so.
You never gave out contributions to groups in Michigan, did you?
No, that is correct.
And you've never dealt with any of the charitable institutions in Detroit that the public affairs employees in Detroit dealt with there, did you?
No, I have not.
Now, you said that at least it was your impression, your belief, that the public affairs representatives in Detroit did pretty much the same work that you did. Is that correct?
That is so.
Okay, now, by those public affairs representatives, I think we're talking about Debbie Llewellyn, Jackie Mike, and Pat Zilke. Is that right?
That is so.
Okay, at least prior to the time you retired. Do you know how long Debbie Llewellyn had been with the company?
30-some years.
Debbie Llewellyn?
I believe, or 28 years or something like that. Very long while.
Do you know how long Jackie Mike had been with the company?
Are you talking about with the company or with public affairs, Mr.
No,
Ellis?
with the company.
Well, she's been with the company a long while, too.
Okay, over 20 years?
I think so.
Okay. And Pat Zilke, how long had Pat Zilke been?
Excuse me, Pat Zilke is 30-some years.
Okay. When you said 30-some years to Debbie Llewellyn, you really meant Pat Zilke, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay, how about Debbie Llewellyn? Do you know how many years she had been?
20-some years she had with the company, yes.
So all three of the public affairs representatives in the Detroit office have been with the company longer than you had, right?
They'd been with the company, but they hadn't been with public affairs all that while.
But in terms of seniority, number of years with the company, they had all been there more years than you had, right?
Yes, they had.
Now, before we move on, I want to ask you a couple questions about the employee events. It would be your view that the employee events were an aid or help in the job of projecting a positive image for the company and the community, right?
Well, yes.
Okay. Now, generally, is it true that you tied employee events to an organization that Unisys gives money to?
To maximize our benefit from it, yes.
Right, okay. So that, for example, what you would do is if Unisys was going to give money to the zoo, you would stage an employee event at the zoo in conjunction with the contribution of money. Is that right?
That is so.
Okay. Now, for example, then, the employees at Unisys would either get discount tickets or maybe free tickets. Is that the way it would work generally?
That is so.
Okay. And the same thing would go at the Museum of Art and the Museum of Art event that you discussed, is that right?
That is correct.
And the same with the Franklin Institute? I'm sorry, that occurred after you left, didn't it?
No.
Were you
I did something with the Franklin Institute.
Okay. And was there an employee event staged at the Franklin Institute?
Yes, there was, for the Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Okay. And you helped in implementing that, right?
I implemented it.
Okay. And how about People's Light and Theater Company out in Malvern? Was there another type of event there?
Yes, there was. There was a picnic and theater, and the employees bought their tickets, and the company supplied some of the funds for the luncheon picnic.
Now, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your work at Sperry prior to when you became a community relations representative. You worked for many years in the employee relations office, right? At least maybe 12, 15 years.
In the employee relations?
Well,
Mr.
it wasn't
Ellis?
called human resources when you first went into that area of work, was it?
It wasn't called employee relations.
Okay. Do you remember what it was called?
It was personnel.
Personnel. Okay. So you were in the personnel office when you started.
Right.
Okay. And eventually personnel got its name changed basically to what we call human resources today.
That is correct.
Okay. Now, you know a number of the employees at Unisys who work in the human resources department now, don't you?
Yes, I do.
For example, you know Mike Losey.
Yes, I do.
And Mr. Losey, I believe you testified as a vice president at Unisys, correct?
That is correct.
It was.
Was.
Right. He's no longer there, right?
That is correct.
You also have known Dermot White for many years, haven't you?
That is so.
And you always had good relations with Mr. Losey and Mr. White, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
You know a woman named Lolly Palacia.
Yes.
Okay. And you've always had good relations with her, haven't
Yes,
you?
I did.
Can you tell us what Lolly Palacia does, please?
She assists Donnie Upman, to the best of my knowledge. She was doing that one.
Okay. And you knew who Donnie Upman was for many years, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And the same would go for Rudy Nearing, who's sitting at the council table here with
That
you,
is
right?
so.
Okay. Now, while you were in employee relations, I think you testified that you had a specific job in employee relations that dealt, you didn't call it, in personnel or human resources. You had a specific job that dealt with the pension program, right?
Yes, that is so.
And that was running these pre-retirement seminars.
Yes.
And as part of your duty of running the pre-retirement seminars, were you required to learn a little bit at least about the pension plan that Sperry had?
Yes, I was. But originally, a pension person came in and spoke to the group.
You say originally. I take it that after a while...
It went on for a number of years, Mr. Ellis.
And then after a while, you got good enough so you could run these things yourself, didn't you?
That is correct.
Okay. And you must, I take it, have given dozens and dozens of seminars over the period that you did that.
That is so.
Okay. And some of them were in Houston?
That's correct.
Pardon me?
That is so.
And some of them in Los Angeles?
That is so.
Minnesota, all over the country.
Right.
Now, you would, by that, I take it, have become somewhat familiar with problems that employees face in making retirement decisions, would you not?
Ours was planning for retirement. It was called pre-retirement, but it was actually planning for retirement, Mr. Ellis.
And in the planning for retirement, one of the decisions one has to make, I assume, is when to retire. Isn't that right?
That is not really a question that comes up. It's all the preparation leading up
Preparation
to
for
it.
retirement.
The when to retire is a very personal thing.
Certainly, certainly. Now, you gave seminars to employees and their spouses, did you not?
That's correct.
Now, did you ever, when you were giving them the seminars, or when you were speaking to employees and their wives throughout the country, did you ever tell them something that sounded somewhat like this? Sir, or madam, or whatever, never make a decision until you have all the facts. Did you ever tell them something like that?
I'm not sure that I ever told them something like that, Mr. Ellis.
Well, if you had, would that have been good advice?
I'm sure it would have been.
Now, as a result of your running all these seminars and dealing with the retirement plans, you knew what the VREP was, right?
I never dealt with the VRIP and with employees.
All right.
I never dealt directly with VRIP and employees.
Okay. Did you occupy a position in 1984 at Sperry in the personnel or human resource function?
Yes, I did, but there was a retirement person in place.
At that time, was there a VRIP implemented to the best of your recollection?
I can't recall, but there might have been.
Okay. And was that an area where you may have known something about the VRIP, or did you not remember?
I was not personally involved in implementing the VRIP program with employees.
Okay. As part of your pre-retirement seminar work, did you have some familiarity with the post-retirement medical benefits?
Just the fact that they existed and what they cost.
And this was something you had to explain to some of the employees who were considering retirement, wasn't it?
No, I didn't have to explain it to them.
Well, did you tell them about it?
Tell them what, Mr. Ellison?
Did you tell them that such a plan existed?
Yes.
And did you
Yes,
tell them what the cost would be?
Yes, yes, indeed.
And did you tell them what the coverages would be?
No, we didn't go into the coverage because there was a printed booklet at one time that we used to give to them.
Oh, okay. So you didn't orally tell them about the coverages. You gave them a book that explained it all to them in black and white.
For the post-retirement.
Right.
Okay.
So it's something that you dealt with during your time at Sperry when you were an employee relations or a personnel person.
Not in great depth.
Okay, but at least enough that you were handing out booklets that contained all the important information in it.
That is so.
Now, I'd like to call your attention to exhibit, and I think you still have the exhibit book in front of
Yes,
you?
I do. Yes, I do, Mr. Ellis.
Please open to exhibit 26, I believe it is. I think you were shown that by your attorney during your direct examination. Excuse me, I apologize for my voice. Now, Mrs. Becker, had you consulted an attorney prior to writing that letter?
Well, first of all, remind the jury what this letter is, because they don't have the exhibits, and
I'm
it's just
sorry,
a
Your
number
Honor.
to that.
Mrs. Becker, am I correct that exhibit number 26 is the letter that you sent to Donnie Upman dated February 21, 1989, in which you stated, and I'll just quote this so that the jury understands which letter it is. In view of the fact that I have been told by both you and Carol Wilgen to take the early retirement package or be laid off in 3 weeks from when you and I met in your office on February 2nd, 1989, I request that you send me the necessary forms that need to be filled out for the retirement package. Now, am I correct? That's the letter you sent to Mr. Upman, is it not?
It has one or two other sentences,
Yeah,
but essentially that's the letter. All right. Now,
Now-
the question about the letter is what?
My question is, had you consulted your attorney prior to sending that letter?
Overruled. I'll let her answer yes or no.
I had met with
So you
my...
only have to answer this yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, would you agree with me, Mrs. Becker, that this letter has the tone and flavor of something that was written by an attorney?
This letter was not written by an attorney.
Objection overruled.
Do you remember the date on which you filed your complaint with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission?
I believe it was the 20th of February.
The day before you sent this letter to Donnie Upman.
That is correct.
Do you know whether the Human Relations Commission has reached a decision on that charge?
Sustained. Would this be a good time to recess, or are you in the middle of something? I mean, if you want to finish a few more questions on this topic, we can go a few more minutes, but
Your Honor, let me ask like 2 or 3 more
Yes,
questions
all right,
on this
sure.
line and be a good time to break.
then we'll have a recess.
Now, Mrs. Becker, let me call your attention to exhibit number 27. Now, I asked you a few moments ago about exhibit number 26. Exhibit number 27 is Mr. Upman's response, just so that the jury understands where we are in the case. I believe you testified on direct from your attorney that you don't think that Mr. Upman was correct correct, or you don't think it was true that he made, when he makes the statement, I don't recall mentioning anything about your being laid off. Didn't you testify that you didn't think that was true or correct?
I can't say if Mr. Upman recalled saying it. What I'm saying is he said it.
He didn't say it, you mean?
I said I can't testify to whether he recalls saying it. What I'm saying is he said it to me.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
In other words, you recognize at the point you received this letter that you and Mr. Upman had a difference of opinion as to what occurred in that meeting.
That is so.
Now, you've known Mr. Upman for, what, about 15 years?
I would guess that's true.
And at the point that he came in to speak to you, that day, I guess it was February 2nd, or maybe the day before, am I correct that you, excuse me, you said to Mr. Upman at that point, well, we have something in common now, don't we? Meaning your cancer.
I'm not sure I used those words. We did discuss the fact that he had been ill. I asked him how he was, and he knew I had been ill.
So, in fact, you
But
did
I
have
was
something in
sick.
common with Mr. Upman, didn't you?
Yes.
And when you got back to work, after having received this letter from Mr. Upman, you didn't go and say, Donnie, you know, this isn't what happened, did you?
No, I didn't.
In fact, you never had any further conversation with Mr. Upman.
Nor did he with me.
Thank you. Your Honor, if we're going to break now, I think it's probably a good time.
Well, I think it's a big good time to recess. Remember, the jury will recess now for the day. I'd like to return tomorrow, 9:45 tomorrow. And the reason for that is I have another hearing at 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's another unrelated case, but it will, I'm sure it will not go beyond 9:30 or so, but I'm going to suggest you be here tomorrow, 9:45, and we'll pick up where we left off. I repeat again how important it is now that you've heard the case. When people ask you about the case, the best thing is to tell them that you'll discuss the case when your work is finished, but you're just not permitted to do it now. And you can see how important it is for you to keep your mind and your memory on what happens here in the courtroom. That is, you'll decide the case based on the evidence you hear in this courtroom, and not from information or ideas or attitudes or anything else you receive from others on the outside. And that's the juror's role. So with that, remember the jury will recess until 9:45 tomorrow. Yes, Mr. Ellis?
Your Honor, I wouldn't normally suggest this in a civil case of this type, but in view of the fact that Mr. Consol and I have been contacted by numerous representatives of the press outside, it may be appropriate to tell the jury that they should limit their...
Oh, yes. You shouldn't discuss any of this with anyone. When I said anyone, I include anyone. That means friends, neighbors, relatives, or other curious persons, whether they're with the press or otherwise. When it's finished, you can do all that if you want to. While you're serving, you shouldn't do it. So thank you very much. I ask you to step down. 9:45 tomorrow. Thank you very much. And give Ms. Garangelo your notes at this time so she can return them to you tomorrow. You may step down, Mrs. Becker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor.
Your Honor, please.
Oh, yes.
One matter that's unrelated to this proceeding.
Sure.
Counsel for Mr. Becker and I also have before Your Honor the Archer matter. That reply to the opposition to the reconsideration, which would fall due tomorrow.
Yes.
We have agreed that I could reply on the 19th because that gives me 5 working days after this matter probably may conclude.
That's all right, Juror. When do you think you can do it by?
I'm confident of the 19th, and I'll
All
give
right.
Your Honor a confirming letter so the record stays
All right,
clear.
then, no problem with that. Even if it
Thank
takes
you.
a day or so longer, that'll be all right.
Thank you.
I didn't see Brett come in. I didn't see Brett come in. He had his chance for a walk when he didn't do it. We have another hearing here, so I'm just going to ask you to kind of just assemble them in one place so the other attorney can use the table. But you can leave everything else here, okay? No, just move your material to one corner of the table. That'll be fine. We'll just recess for 5 minutes.
For more information on these proceedings, you can write to the Federal Court at 601 Market Street, Suite number 2609, in care of the District Clerk's Office, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The zip code is 19106. Join C-SPAN for continuing gavel-to-gavel coverage of the U.S. House of Representatives. House members will reconvene after their district work period on Tuesday. Live coverage from Capitol Hill begins Tuesday at noon Eastern